Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting. It is Thursday, July 20th, and we have a quorum. First item on our opening item agenda is to approve the agenda. Do I have a motion? Motion by Rich, seconded by Susan. All in favor, raise your hands. And that passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone. Next, we'll move on to public comment.
Good evening. For some members that do not know me and staff, my name is Robert Plowski. I'm the Vice Chair of the Regional Transit Authority Citizens Advisory Committee, and I'm from Southgate, Wayne County. For some of our new members, on behalf of our committee, I'd like to welcome you to the board, but also welcome staff and also express the electation of Kathleen Mozak as chair earlier this year. We are proud to see some of the progress under Eric Mahler being carried on from our chair, Kathleen Mozak. And today, regarding the budget. Now, Dina, I'd like to thank you for all the progress and work that you've done on the budget over the last few months into the rest of this year. I had the pleasure to take a look at the budget earlier yesterday actually, and just seeing the amount of progress and investments being done to increase, but not just increase our costs and capital, state and local for our system. Now with the $60 million increase for public transit, thank you Representative Jason Morgan for all the tremendous work on campaigning for that. The question I pose is it being factored in? The budget process is not going to start until early January, but we are going to be receiving money coming in earlier than that. Like I said before, the budget is one of the biggest critical pieces to be able to increase public transit over the course of the several years to come, including the money that's coming in from Congress to be able to fund the YTC projects in the near months. Now, the YTC is a major project going forward into the future of this area. Just as a matter of fact, YTC, yes, we're seeing staffing increasing in our system, but most of all, it really needs help, all of it. And I'm pretty sure you've seen it from customer service, getting complaints time and time again, but also the lack of investment. I've seen overdoses, I have seen crime, I have seen nothing but despair with the YTC. With this increase in funding, we'll be able to see a change in YPSI, but also put YPSI back on the map to where it needs to be. With this budget, the $60 million, I'm currently not seeing in the budget. I'm only seeing what's been included from the state, from last year, and the local, from our millage dollars. The only question I pose is when we'll be including the $60 million that will be invested for all public transit agencies all across the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pulaski. Deb, is there anyone online? Or Kirk, are you wanting to speak?
Sure.
Welcome.
Good evening. Kirk Westfall, 3505 Charter Place, otherwise known as Route 65 and sometimes number 3 bus rider. It's great to be here at my first AAATA meeting in person, and I just want to say up front I regret that I have to scoot out after public comment for a different board meeting, but I hope this isn't the end of our conversation. I'd appreciate if anybody wants to get in touch individually to chat, either through social media, or my email address is write2kirk@gmail.com. Two general areas of question and comment. One has to do with goals and metrics, and the other has to do with HOV lanes. So on the subject of metrics, I was paging through the ENDS monitoring reports, and while I found them really interesting and valuable, I'd love to see the comprehensive KPI metrics that I think were in place I want to say 2017 or so, that showed overall system metrics as well as by route, and I just think that would be valuable in terms of looking at where to allocate future resources. I'd also really encourage folks to look at peer comparisons like other college towns, pardon me, across the Midwest, and not just in Michigan. In terms of timelines, I was curious if there were timelines associated with any of the projects in the long-range plans or a committee that tracks and reports out on the progress of these. This is something that I'm encouraging Ann Arbor City Council to do. It's something that we got to start on when I was there, and there's a lot of other cities that are doing great things just with transparency and metrics, and I find it's a really helpful way for the community when they vote for a representative or vote for a millage, just to show, hey, this is what we're implementing. We've got these goals. We may or may not make them. We course correct and adjust according to circumstances, but it gives you a really nice visual way of showing the community that what you're working toward. So I'd encourage, I'm sure there's great examples of transit operators doing dashboards. I remember hearing about signal priority implementation and other things like express bus service in the funding plans, but I haven't, granted I haven't been seeking it out, but I'd love to just to get updates on items like those. I think they're super exciting. And speaking of express buses, I'm a huge advocate of dedicated bus lanes, both from a transit efficiency and roadway safety standpoint. It's my opinion. I don't think we can or should wait for a grand finalized implementation of bus rapid transit. As much as I would love to see that, I think just making incremental improvements, like collaborating with the city, say, hey, we would love to have one of these lanes for our buses. It'd be great for ridership and efficiency. Personally, I think reallocating lanes on roads like Plymouth and Washtenaw as soon as possible is the most critical and urgent conversation that the city and TheRide, and in the case of Washtenaw, MDOT can have and should be having. It's a great moment, I think, on city council in terms of transit and also the state legislature. And I was thinking about this the other day. We're just looking at a map of Michigan and seeing what a minuscule amount of land is actually next to transit that has like 15-minute headways. I think this is a really unique moment and an urgent mandate that we have to start reallocating lanes away from single occupancy vehicles. And it also leads to greater pedestrian and driver safety when you reallocate lanes away. So I'd love to see you guys taking a leadership role in that conversation. In 2017, the Ann Arbor Observer ran a blurb in its question corner called HOV lanes, and it specifically has to do with, very few people know we actually have HOV lanes in Ann Arbor. And for folks who drive up Glen Avenue or Fuller Road, right by the statue, by the hospital parking structure, you'll see this little sign. This is from Google Street View. It says HOV lane, carpools and buses only. And so some intrepid researcher wrote into the Observer and said, HOV vehicle, high occupancy vehicle lanes are marked on each side of Glen Avenue. Are they actively enforced? And Ann Arbor Observer says, HOV lanes are created to promote carpooling. Those on Glen and nearby Fuller Road are a remnant of a federal grant from 1984. Short arterial HOV lanes such as this are not very useful, emails city spokesperson Robert Killar, and we are currently investigating if the signs and markings can be removed. I think we had the right idea in 1984, honestly. And they went on to say, the lanes are not actively enforced. To my knowledge, tickets are not being issued for this and never have been, emails AAPD Sergeant Bill Clock. So we have HOV lanes, which I think we should, instead of removing, expand upon. And U of M claims to be still invested in the idea of a campus connector, but all I see is them building more parking structures. So I think TheRide can be a leader in this discussion by collaborating with the city and reviving HOV lanes and expanding them. And lastly, on that note, I'm guessing many of you know about the MDOT PEL study on Washtenaw east of 23. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that two of the alternatives that they're talking about include reallocating one of the car lanes in each direction to an HOV-only lane. They call them BAT lanes, which is kind of cool. I never really heard of a BAT lane. Business access transit lanes, and they show one of the lanes being allocated for buses and just one lane each direction for non-HOV cars. And I think a clear case can be made that these are the only safe options for pedestrians and motorists, especially the option that includes roundabouts. And it also happens to be the best option for efficient bus travel. I'm pretty sure you've been a consistent presence at Reimagine Washtenaw meetings over the years, but this really seems to be a critical moment in the trajectory of Washtenaw and on one of your most important routes. And I wish I would hear this expressed publicly by the board or staff. I was surprised to see in your packet the following statement: Michigan Department of Transportation does not presently allow bus lanes, and that this is a 5 to 10 year timeline discussion. So I was confused by that and would love to talk with anyone willing to talk to me about it, because I would take it on my personal mission to mitigate this challenge in Lansing. So thank you again for your service and for listening.
Thank you. Deb, do we have anybody online?
We do, Jim Mogensen, and you are able to talk, sir.
So I'm hoping to talk at the beginning of the meeting about Title VI and at the end of the meeting about bus rapid transit routes. So let's talk about Title VI. So it's that process is starting. You're using the circular that was created in 2012. And over the 10 years, agencies and consultants have figured out ways to utilize those guidelines that allow the agencies to pass the requirements. There was a point in which everybody didn't realize that they actually had to file plans. Nobody was actually worrying about that. And then all of a sudden, this happened, and people actually lost, in Los Angeles, they lost a $300 million project because they just kind of forgot to do the analysis. But now people are doing the analysis, but the analyses are set up so that essentially everything's okay. At the end of 2021, the Federal Transit Administration considered revising the circular. It had been 10 years, so they opened up a docket, and I was one of the 100 or so people who entered comments into that docket. I haven't heard anything since, but that process has started to update that circular. So I just bring this up because this is a real challenge. When I look at the materials that are in the process that have been formatted as a presentation for this meeting, it follows that basic script. And the challenge I think we have is that we have a commitment to equity in the community, and we had the need to follow the regulations. And somewhere in between, there's this real challenge of figuring out how to make that happen. And particularly with policy governance, where from my standpoint, the ends policies are vague enough to allow those things to happen. And it may be more difficult, even if you have that equity conversation, to move beyond what's commonly seen as general industry practice about how to manage the challenge of Title VI compliance within the context of the whole ridership versus coverage conversation, which is happening nationwide. So I look forward to formatting some comments moving forward on the policy changes. And thank you very much for your time and attention, as always.
Thank you. Deb, is there anyone else online?
We do, Jesse Wall, and you are unmuted.
Hello, my name is Jesse Wall, and I was wondering, why can't you just shut the fuck up, please, with your dumbass? Thank you.
We have no one else.
Thank you, Deb. That will close public comment. We're on now to 1.3, general announcements. Do we have any general announcements this evening? Seeing none, we're going to move on to the consent agenda. On that consent agenda are our board meeting minutes from June, committee meeting minute summaries, and FYI 24 board committee meeting dates. I'm hoping that everyone had a chance to review all of that, and if so, would someone like to move this into the record by making a motion?
So moved, Rich.
Seconded by Simi. All in favor, raise your hands. Thank you very much. That passed unanimously. We will now move on to our special item. Mr. Forrest Yang will be presenting 3.1, our Title VI presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, thank you, Madam Chair. So I have three people should be virtually joining us. I haven't seen them on the screen. Okay, I see Deb is bringing them up. All right. All right. Surprise! More people than what I thought.
Welcome.
Anyway, so on the screen, I probably let George introduce his team. George Harris from Capstas Consulting Group, who's helping us with Title VI update program update project. And then, like the right corner, Alice is our staff member. She is the senior transit analyst. She's the project manager working with the consultant. George, why don't you just introduce your team before I move on my introduction?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. George Harris, head of Calyptus Consulting. We've been working with federal agencies and particularly FTA since 1996 on Title VI and other civil rights areas. And we probably have reviewed about 400 Title VI plans. And, you know, we acknowledge the comment made by Mr. Mortensen on sort of the, you know, variations in some of the plans and so forth. And we actually did also make a comment on the docket. So this is good that there's change. Sherry Snyder is senior consultant for us. She used to run the FTA Triennial Review Program. So she's a good person to know. And she's also done Title VI. And just one other thing is late last year, FTA had a backlog of reviewing the Title VI program. So they asked us, and particularly Sherry, to review those plans in FTA's stead. So we got a lot of good information from FTA about how these things work. So glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I will be conducting the presentation once we get started again.
Okay. Thanks, George. As George said, they have a lot of experience, especially working with FTA. We're familiar with the process and the FTA requirement. Anyway, so as I mentioned a couple months ago, we're in the process to update our Title VI program. This is a mandatory requirement by the FTA. Every 3 years, so we have to submit our update. As part of this process, you know, we're also making some change to the Title VI complaint procedure, equity analysis policy, public input policy. George is going to give us an overview of the changes. But again, this is like a regulatory requirement process. We need to submit it by end of November. So right now, starting from today, we're sort of going into a 30-day public engagement period. And then we are having 2 in-person public meetings next week, and then 2 virtual public meetings next week. We also have a website, email, phone number set up for public feedback input. And then by the end of that process, we're going to summarize all the feedback, bring that back to the board. Not likely in August, most likely in September, for your approval of those policies, and then possibly the entire Title VI program update. So it will be in time for us to submit to FTA. It will be early, actually. All right, so I think before I turn that over to George, I want to say this is more information for the public. If you need a translation service, you can, I mean, all those materials, including tonight presentation, are available in 5 different languages. And then they're on the website, all the materials. And then if they need any translation service, they can call 734-973-6500. So an information specialist will connect to our translation service. And then also they can email Title VI program at TheRide.org, so we can respond that way. Now it's all yours, George.
Okay, thank you. Let me share this slide deck. Promise it's not gigantic, so that's good. Anyway, can everyone see it? Can you see it okay? And make it bigger?
We can see it all right, except for it's not very large. We can see the entire screen, not just the presentation. Is there a way to just see the presentation so it's larger?
Is that better?
Nothing changed. If everyone else is okay, I'm fine.
Is that better?
No, it hasn't changed. We seem to be seeing the inside of your email, not the presentation itself.
Okay, hold on for a second. Get back out to this. Okay. Can you see that?
It hasn't changed. I'm wondering if it's frozen or if perhaps you need to close out your email and open the PowerPoint separately.
I can easily do that.
George, you may want to try stop sharing, yes, and then open the PowerPoint and share that again.
Okay.
That's good.
Wonderful.
Sorry about that. Okay, again, thank you for having us present, Charlie and I. So as Forrest was indicating, this is a federal requirement. Anyone who receives money from FTA has to develop a Title VI program, and this has to be updated every 3 years. And there's the whole purpose is to ensure that the agencies who are spending money are not discriminating against any rider or the general population on the basis of race, color, or national origin, and also denied benefits. So relates to information, communication, consideration of routes, services, paratransit, fares, fare media. And as Forrest was indicating, your program is due on November 30th. FTA has reviewed it, the draft, and it's concurred. So we're just adding some additional information as we will cover here in the presentation. So key
Sorry,
areas
George.
yes.
can I stop you for a moment?
Yeah.
The screen sharing switched to a document. Looks like we're looking at a PDF file right now.
Okay. Hold on. Is that
Yes.
better?
Yep. Now it's back.
Sorry. Okay. Uh, so as just moving from this second to third slide, so there are some key changes that have been made since the 2020 version of this. One had to do with upgrading the complaint procedure for folks who feel like they have been discriminated against. The agency has really a good process that they're using. We're just tidying up some of the timeframes and so forth on that. We've updated the equity analysis policy. This relates to circumstances where the agency has made major service changes and/or has made fare changes up or down and have changed fare media and sort of how the agency evaluates equity of those changes for low income and minority populations. We also have updated the public input policy. This is a typical thing because of technology. There's a whole different way and method of communicating changes and service information. So that policy has been updated. And then, as I mentioned, we updated the basic information on many of these areas based on a rider survey that was completed in 2022. So we have some pretty good information that we're using to, we know more about riders. New census data, the 2020 census data produced information on routes and also using one of the subsets there to determine that there are other limited English populations that have to be communicated to. I'll go through those as well. And then in addition to having the update every 3 years, the agency has to perform performance monitoring of its service standards, like on-time performance, amenities, things of that sort. So that work is in process and will be in the final plan. So those are the 4 areas that I'll be speaking of today. So let's talk about those changes by area. First thing we did on the complaint procedure is we wanted to make sure that we updated the translated material about how to file a complaint, either on the bus or with the driver or in the station or on the website. We have now information that the complaint procedure is translated into Chinese, Spanish, Arabic, and Korean. Those are the languages that have more than 1,000 folks in your population that speak English not very well. So now they're able to see the complaint procedure and the complaint form. We updated the information to say that the complaints have to be filed within 180 calendar days of the alleged incident. This gives more time for the public to submit their complaint. And then, as I was saying earlier, the logistics of once we receive it or you receive it, you then go back to the complainant within 7 days and indicate, yep, got it. And then within 30 days, have a written response to the complainant with a determination of whether it was legit or not. These come in many different ways presently. They come by phone, they come by email, they come by the formal complaint form basis. And there's also some informal complaints that are being reviewed. And this agency has, in our opinion, a good process of getting the complaints, evaluating them. We're just buttoning up the timing to make sure that we're giving proper information to the complainant when they file a complaint. So that's really what we had changed in the complaint procedure. So now the equity analyses, well, there's two pieces to this. One relates to service change. The other piece relates to fare changes. So we'll talk about service changes, major service changes. So we basically changed the way that this is defined to say that a change in 25% of either service hours or miles, weekly service hours or miles for any route or at one time made or cumulatively over 36 months, that would be a major service change. So we wanted to capture not necessarily the first service change on a route, but also cumulatively over 36 months. You add them together to determine the impact. We also added the implementation of a new route that would require a major service change analysis, and then also elimination of a route. So if we eliminate a route, implement a new route, we make a change of 25% of the weekly revenue hours, we have to conduct an equity analysis. The other part of this is the fare change. So any change in fare, this has been something that FDA has worked on with the agencies over the years. Any change, it can go up and down, plans, monthly passes, things of that sort, that has to be considered as a fare change. And then any change to fare media, buying cards that can be used from one system to another, as an example, that would be subject to the fare change. So those are the two things. So we've got the major service change, define that, and then fare changes being any change or change to payment or fare media. So as we think about the service change, what we've defined in the program is looking at a disparate impact that relates to minority and a disproportionate burden that relates to more toward low income is determined by either comparing the proportion of the population within a quarter mile of change route that's minority and low income with the proportion of the population for the whole service area. So if you have a route, it's a minority route or a low income route, you compare that change to how many people are affected to what the proportion of the population that's in the minority low income for the entire service area. So you kind of get a sense for that analysis. And then on the portion of the low income riders, so you've got population in the number one, and you have riders in number two, so that you're comparing the portion of riders on the route or segment, same kind of analysis compared to the low income riders and minority riders for the entire system. So you've got two different kinds of analyses here. One having to do with population, one has to do with route. Generally speaking, when you have a fare change, use the rider information because you have current riders that are now using the system. And when you have service change, it relates to the whole population. So we have changed the policy to try to clarify these things. And then we said, what happens if the impact on minority or low income is 10% higher than the population of the service area? We said if it's 10% or greater, we have to conduct the agency has to conduct a disparate impact analysis. And this is a common standard. It's mentioned in the FTA circular as a sort of a standard, statistically valid percent. There are agencies that have higher percent, 20, 25%. Jerry can speak to that, but we feel like 10% is a good number given your agency. And FTA and their Title VI plan pretty much, or their circular, say that you have to have it so that you don't do it for every one of them, but you have to have a meaningful number so that you actually do some of these. So if you go 20, 25%, you may not get any, analysis done because it's too high a percentage. So we feel that the 10% kind of jives with what FTA has in their circular, and it's common for agencies that are similar, bus transport, and also other types of transportation you offer. On the fare change, the same type of analysis is done. So we look at fare changes for the various fare categories, per trip, per week, per month, and then compared what impact that fare change has on minorities or persons with low income for the whole system. And we kind of do it, we've put in your policy and analysis of that. And basically, we have a possible disproportionate burden if, in fact, there's a more than 10% impact to the low-income riders in particular, than the portion of the minority low-income riders wide. And you do have a lot of minority routes in your system. So, chances are you're going to capture many of these fare changes and service changes as you move forward. So we just want to make it much more clearer about how it's done. And then, the agency then, once they have one of these, they have to conduct a service or fare equity analysis. And then they have to include it in the Title VI update the next time around. So that was the change to the equity analyses. The public input policy, basically, we included those definitions of the major service change and fare changes, as we just discussed. And then we have incorporated other current practices, approaches, and technologies. Elise has put together a litany of things that now the agency is doing, has done in terms of publicizing service changes and fare changes and just anything that requires public involvement. And now we've talked about the translation of these things and also providing input to those LEP communities, limited English population communities who are looking to get information. So there wasn't a significant change. We've got various Facebooks and Instagram and all those things also in there. And as technology changes, I'm sure there'll be more that we'll see. And then the other changes we have is related to the language assistance plan. You see there in the first line, when you add languages such as Korean and Arabic, the agency has to translate those documents or have the ability to translate those documents for any public-facing communication like service plans and applications and things of that sort. So there's an adjustment to the assistance plan there. We also use the census information to look at demographic and service profiles. All the routes now are defined up to date in terms of where there are minority routes or low income routes. What are they? Where are they within the route? Where is the population located within a quarter of a mile? We also picked up on the survey, the rider survey, information on ridership and travel patterns and, preferences and so forth. That's kind of translated into sort of customer service kind of approach. And then also the service standards monitoring. I think everyone knows that, there was some data issues last year. That has been fixed, and now we have better information to look at on-time performance and things of that sort. So that's being updated. So, and you can see underneath there, these are the data that we looked at, the census data, the ACS, which is a great source for LEP. And we use that rider survey pretty generously in the update, and then the operational data for the service standards. So those were the changes. Sherry, do you have any comments on any of that? Oh, you're muted because you're not on the. But I saw you shake your head. You said no. So
I
anyway,
actually do have a couple of quick questions, if you don't mind. I suppose the thing I want to know most is for clarification. On page 2, it says that no person shall, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin. I'm a little confused. Where do seniors, women, other people, do they not fall under Title VI? And or is that wording missing? Or do they just file a complaint with the agency under other means?
they're not included.
Okay.
So there's an EEO process. They can apply an EEO complaint as a member of the community. They can also external. They can also apply. They can submit an ADA complaint if they're a senior, and they feel like the agency is not stopping an appropriate spot for their front of their house or things of that sort. The age of an individual, unfortunately, is not here. It's either an EO or other mechanisms, but this is narrowed into these 3 areas.
Thank you.
And by the way, we see when we evaluate complaints, not necessarily at Ann Arbor, but in other agencies where there's a mix, right? There's an older gentleman or a woman, they're of color. They might be speaking with an accent. So you got them all kind of pulled together there. So, you do capture some of that through the complaint process.
Thank you. George, were you going to open it up to other questions from the board? Or is there more presentation for us?
No, I think that's it. The last slide relates to how to provide comments for those that are online, seeing this online in the audience. As Forrest was indicating, there are 2 in-person sessions at each of the transit centers. There'll be staff there answering questions on all this. You can visit the Title VI part of their website that has all this information translated. You can email. There's the email if you need translation. You have questions. You could call that number, or you can write a letter if you wish with any kind of input. And then this is just on the question feedback, both for the board and for the public. You just raise your hand at the bottom of the screen. I'm sure that's being tracked. And then if you are calling by phone, just press #9 and then you'll be identified. I don't know if there's anyone else on the line from the agency that would have anything else to say here, but you're also able to ask questions. And that's it for us today.
Thank you very
But we'd be
much.
glad to answer any questions.
Rich has his hand up.
Yeah, actually, I have 2 questions. One, thank you for putting this together. Is it safe for me to assume that these changes, it's actually not required, we're just doing these to be more proactive? Or is, I mean, based on this analysis, I mean, it's our decision to make these changes and actually make the way that we're evaluating and providing methods or input is more a internal decision, right? It's not being dictated to us.
It is your choice based on the equity analysis part is your choice. You look at your ridership, you look at your policy, you make your choice about what percentages and how you do the analysis. The only kind of requirement, Rich, is you have to update the information for the census. So the last time you submitted your plan, it was before the 2020 census was available. Now it's available, so you have to then update your information on that. So that is a requirement, which is now updated. So there's some, I guess the answer is some of it, yep, it's up to you. Like complaints and the other, the equity analysis, but in terms of the updates for your demographics and your limited English population based on census information, that is a requirement that you look at it and then make changes.
Okay, thanks. So I want to, I guess, give a huge thanks to the staff for us in particular for taking that initiative to get that done. My next question then, and it may not be an appropriate place to ask this question, I was just kind of curious, on average, what are the number of submissions that we get regarding Title VI in a year?
Complaints?
Another way to put it, sure.
Okay. I don't know, and probably somebody from the RIDE is probably better, but to answer that question, Elise, are you a better person to answer? I mean, we have information that we reviewed, Sherry and I. They aren't a plethora of them. They're not like two or three a year that are formal, would be what I remember, but it's subject to check.
Yeah, we just had our FTA triennial review last year. Actually, we got 9. I mean, there are complaints, but they're not confirmed, right? So like George said, normally maybe get 2, 3 a year.
Cool, thank you.
And I can just tell you that you have a really good process and you have a great person doing this, very passionate. She goes to the nth degree for your complaints. I'm very impressed with her. I don't remember her name, but compared to all the 400 agencies we've talked to, she got it together. She's got the passion. I'm going to answer this question. I'm going to give them feedback. So, you know, that part was pretty impressive.
Just to add, her name is Latanya, as our customer service officer. She's great. It reports to George.
Are there any other questions from the board at this time? Yes, Monica.
Is this on? Yes. Excuse me. I just have one question because I found out how minority was defined. I read the packet, so I got that one. But what is considered low income? How is that defined?
Actually, it's defined by the Department of Labor and the poverty, what the poverty line is. So it's a set dollar amount that is updated regularly. So there's a common reference point for it. So it's not up to the agency to determine. It's there's 150% of the poverty line, depends on the size of the family, but it's pretty well prescribed, and most folks just take what is presented by that agency. Am I right there, Sherry? Okay.
So that gets to my next question, because basically minority is defined and how it is broke down inside of the policy. Is there any way that data from the, I guess you could say is it the poverty index that you or the U.S. Department of Labor can be included so people will know exactly how that is defined?
Yes, are you saying within our plan or on the website or what?
Both, maybe,
Okay.
because that way it makes it clear.
Okay, easily done, and it can, they change, and it's actually a combination of Department of Labor and Census that does this, so there, you can easily, I think we mention it in the plan, but we don't really define it in like quantitative terms, so we can easily do that.
Thank you.
Yes, Rich?
Actually, I'm glad you brought that on, Mark, because that did get me thinking about this. Because I think in here we talk about low income, and I mean that's the definition of that can be pretty broad, right? Because you have federal poverty level, but you also have like Alice population, which historically both those groups have challenges with transportation costs in general. So I don't know what I'm going to request here, but I would be interested to see how much the Alice population is also affected by this, if that isn't like a huge burden for staff to get us those numbers. Because for instance, in like Washtenaw County, there's actually a larger proportion of our population that falls in Alice than actually falls in the poverty, but the two of them together is almost, I think it's over 40% of our population in Washtenaw County fall into poverty plus Alice.
Can you define Alice?
Yeah, it stands for asset limited, income constrained, and employed. So it's basically the working poor, and it actually varies by county. So, for instance, in Wayne County, it's over 50% of the population falls into Alice and poverty, and in Washtenaw County, it's almost approaching 50%. And it's increasing year after year. So it's actually a bigger problem, and it's a statewide issue. The United Way nationwide publishes that data, I think, every year, but it's usually like a year or two behind.
Do we have any other questions at this time?
So just to clarify, to reach the request, you would like to see the population, the percentage population under the poverty line, 150% poverty line plus Alice program?
I mean, I'm happy to chat offline because I definitely don't
Sure.
want to cause. I mean, there's a standard approach I know you guys take on this. This is just kind of curious for me because I think the Alice population overall a lot of times gets forgotten, and they're, like I said, they're a growing group that if we are concerned about, because we say low income, and so I think the definition of that is where I'm kind of going like, well, what exactly do we define as that? Is it purely just poverty, or is it actually folks that we could broaden the definition of low income? So yeah, we can chat offline, and then we
Sure.
can maybe figure something out there.
Just to clarify, like George said, our definition for the purpose of this equity analysis is 150% of the federal poverty line.
Oh, so that'd be 50% above the poverty line, or
150%.
150%
Yeah.
above?
That's
Okay.
right, that's right, yeah.
Below, right? 100% times the
Yeah,
poverty
for
line.
additional.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I guess maybe then my request would be to see if that does actually encompass that Alice population, at least for Washtenaw County, where most of our data is supposed to be based around. And I can help with that if you like.
Okay,
Okay, thanks.
thank you.
Lots of good discussion here this evening. Do we have any other questions? Seeing none, Forrest, thank you. Thank you to the consultants for your presentation. We appreciate it. And Forrest,
Great.
you said that we will be hearing from you in September, not August.
Right, so the public engagement period ends August 20. It will be too late for us to summarize everything coming back. So likely we're going to come back with the full program update, including those policy change in September board meeting, and then we can approve that. I mean, of course, it's up to board. Either you want to approve that in the consensus agenda or do another presentation. Yeah, it's going to be a board call.
May I ask, could you please share with the board through an email would be fine. The dates of public engagement that will be happening in person at the Blake and at the Ypsi Transit Center, as well as what will be happening virtually. And I would like to extend an invitation to the board. I and other members of the board have enjoyed and had a really good experience attending these meetings through the long-range plan, all of the other things that we've been looking at over the years. And it's so important for the board to hear what our public is saying, not just through getting the report from staff, but also engaging ourselves. And so I would extend to you, please try to attend at least one meeting if you can, and just to wet your feet and really hear what the public has to say. And also, I think it's important for the public to know that the board is engaged beyond just coming to a board meeting, but also out there, you know, boots on the ground, listening to what the public has to say.
My apology, I haven't
no.
shared that information, but I will do, yeah. I will send that email to everybody.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Forrest.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for
Great.
that.
Thank you.
Thank you, George, and your team.
Have a good night. Thank you. See you. Thanks, Sherry. Bye, Elise.
All right. We're going to wrap that up then and move on to Mr. Chang, ownership linkage under 4.1.
Hello, everyone. Thanks. I have a little bit of a meteor update for this time. After finally adding more to the acronym soup that we had with OLTF of the Ownership Linkage Task Force, we're going to change that now. After getting rid of everyone used to saying that, we are now the Open Dialogue Task Force, so the ODTF. We figured it was a bit easier to understand its actual purpose, especially internally and also externally. A couple things. One, Dr. Gerber has agreed to join. So the task force is Jesse, Elizabeth, Susan, and me. We do have a meeting this coming Wednesday, July 26th, with Mayor Taylor of Ann Arbor. It'll be Jesse, Elizabeth, Kathleen, and me, plus Matt. Susan, who is part of the task force, unfortunately isn't able to attend, but your presence and influence will definitely be felt and appreciated. So that's going to be great. I have a presentation in the works. My goal is to hopefully wrap it up tomorrow and get it to the committee either tomorrow over the weekend to make it to get some input and drafts. I'm sorry it's so late, but it's just been a couple crazy months for me. Once we meet with the mayor, the committee is already scheduled to meet and do like a download and a recap internally, discuss the feedback, and then discuss potential approaches forward regarding dialogue with the city of Ann Arbor, and also our next approach, which will be with the city of Ypsilanti mayor. So we have to schedule that next. And then after that, we'll be meeting with the Ypsi Township supervisor. So that's the update I have. Cool.
Excellent. Does anyone have any questions for Rich or his team? Thank you, Rich. All right, moving on, we're going to monitoring 5.1, the task force update. Mr. Mike Alamang.
Thank you, Kathleen. At the last board meeting, you probably recall that we talked about the monitoring task force was working on evaluating a proposal that Rose Mercier made, and that was basically taking a look at policy 2.4, which is financial planning and budgeting, and expanding that quite broadly to, first of all, broaden it beyond just financial, all kinds of planning. And part of that would also be incorporating what is now 2.8, which is a CEO succession. And actually that among a lot of other things were being broadened according to her proposal to include the deputy CEOs too in terms of their succession planning. When we met with and discussed this, I believe it was at the Finance Committee meeting, it was brought to our attention that because of all the work that was being done in the next couple of months regarding the budget, that getting into the details of 2.4, which is financial planning, and then broadened from there, would just be too much time taken by staff during this critical time of the budget. So actually, no, that was, Kathleen, that was actually at the governance committee, not at the finance committee. And so it was proposed and agreed that looking at 2.4 and Rose's proposal would actually wait, and we would wait until October to do that. And as a result of that decision by the governance committee, then we actually canceled the monitoring task force meeting that was coming, I think just about a week after that, because we were not prepared to do that, or we didn't have other things on our agenda either. So that's how we stand. We will come back to 2.4, Rose's proposal. It's quite complicated, if you've seen that in the prior board books. And the task force, the monitoring task force will be meeting next. And we don't yet have the agenda, but Rosa Maria, I have some ideas about that. You probably do too. And we need to discuss that soon.
Thank you, Mike. Does anyone have any questions for Mike or the task force? Seeing none, we'll move on to financial conditions and activities, 2.5.5.1. It is a review. It's something that came up at last board meeting, and Ms. Reed will be presenting. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As Madam Chair stated, I'm presenting in the board packet a revised table for policy 2.5.5.1. This policy was reviewed at the last board meeting, but in this particular sub-policy, the board agreed that the interpretation was compliant, but that the evidence maybe didn't support the interpretation. And wholly, after much discussion, it was determined that the board would like a revised table to demonstrate the explanation that I provided. And I have done that. As you can see, there is revised evidence, there's a revised table, and there is a revised a note describing some additional, the most significant change in the table. This information was presented to the Finance Committee and reviewed at the Finance Committee last week, including the treasurer, and is presented to you for consideration today.
Thank you, Dina. Mike, would you like to share what the Finance Committee, what conclusion they came to?
Yes, I would be very happy to. As Dina said, she did make really a detailed presentation of the Finance Committee. We had some very good discussions, questions, good answers, and it was the consensus of the Finance Committee at the end of that time that we agreed that the revised evidence that she presented was compliant, and I don't think we are going to be voting again on this, but the last board meeting said that just bring that back, and the Finance Committee was happy with what presented. And if we were to vote again, we would say that the evidence is compliant.
Thank you, Mike. So this is the first time in my knowledge or recent history that the board has asked for something to come back where the interpretation was reasonable, but the evidence is not, and we've been represented with evidence. Was it good enough that we voted last time, or do we need to re-vote and re-accept the evidence as represented? I'm not clear on that procedure. Yes, Matt, I'm looking to you because you have the history of all of this, and again, it's not something I've experienced in my entire time on the board.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I don't recall the board doing this before either. The board has the latitude to monitor any policy or any part of any policy at any time you like. So this is completely within your purview. There's nothing offsides with any of this. Because, and Dina and I were speaking about this before the meeting and conferring at the minutes simply record that you asked for this to be brought back. If that's satisfactory to you, I would suggest it's satisfactory and above board. This is your policy, your monitoring, your request. You can sort of define how you want to do that. If you'd like to take a vote, you certainly can. If you want to simply say, great, thank you, that's probably acceptable as well.
As a steward of the board, as the chair, I don't feel that it's my decision to make alone. I feel highly comfortable with what's been presented this evening and do not feel that we have to take a vote, but if somebody opposes that and wants to make a motion to take a vote, I would certainly understand. Yes, Mike?
I'm not advocating for another vote. I just wanted to point out that our typical procedure is if the monitoring report was non-compliant in a certain area, that the CEO was to propose a time that he would make it compliant. And therefore, I would say this falls within that, and that he has made it compliant or very quickly within a month. And I think that's consistent with the way we do things, but it never came in exactly this way.
Thank you for that, Mike. Seeing no other conversation? Oh, Jesse, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
With that, normally that if staff says we'll be in compliance by a certain time, the report would be submitted to us, and then we would take a vote on compliance. And so I think, given that it is compliance, I think it would be worthwhile to have it on the record that, if we don't vote to have this in compliance, the next time this comes up, we're going to have on the record that it was not compliant. And I think that shortchanges the work that was done by staff to satisfy the board request. So I guess I would like to make a motion that we accept it as compliant.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that because I think Jesse makes a very good point.
I agree. Is there any discussion on the motion itself? Seeing no discussion, let's take a vote. All those in favor of accepting the new revised evidence as being compliant, please raise your hand. And thank you, that passed unanimously. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for your good work. And thank you, staff, for Dina, for getting this to us so quickly, especially during budget season.
Yes, thank you for entertaining the update. I appreciate it.
Next on our agenda is 2.2 treatment of staff, and that is Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The monitoring report for policy 2.2, the treatment of staff, begins on page 67 of your packet. The service committee reviewed this in detail. We had a very good discussion. You can see some of their comments on page 11 in the minutes. They have recommended that the board consider adoption as a level B. I will not go into detail, but I would like to talk about a couple of things that came up during the committee meeting. First of all, as you can see in the color coding on page 69, we're mostly compliant except for one area of partial compliance in an upper level policy. That partial compliance then renders the entire policy partially compliant. That one has to do with a question about attrition rates, which had been sort of trending in a direction contrary to what we would like to see. So hopefully that will become compliant in the future, and we'll move in the right direction there. That is the only sort of reason for partial compliance here. There was really good discussion at the committee, and I won't put words in anybody's mouth, but a lot of things were brought up that staff have continued to think about. The attrition rate issue, for example, was brought up, was mentioned in the survey. I think some board members pointed out that changes in attrition are not normal year to year, and measuring our compliance by year to year change may not be the right way to do that. We agree. In the past, we've also used comparisons to federal average attrition rates and turnover. We're thinking about sort of reverting back to that in part on this, based on this comment and this experience. The staff survey is something that always gets attention every time we do this. It's something that management pores over every year. There's some good points. I won't go through them. I think if someone wants to raise them, they certainly can. Overall participation was down a bit this year. It's true. Even though the numbers generally were heading in a good direction. And someone raised good points about where the threshold should be with that. And I think those are all reasonable things. It is challenging to use a staff survey as evidence, as we're discovering. There's a lot of outside variables that can affect staff's perception of their job, perception of many things. So it's kind of hard to untangle cause and effect in that respect. Nevertheless, we're continuing and committed to making sure staff are engaged and moving those numbers in a positive direction. There was some confusion about where the compliance timeline was for policy 221. We had a bit of a formatting error. It sort of migrated higher in the page than it was expected. It should be at the bottom of the page. I apologize for any confusion. And then an interesting comment in the survey about greater clarity, particularly on rationales for measures and achievement, which I think is an interesting, sort of detailed in the weeds policy governance sort of question, but a good one. And we'll be talking to Rose Mercier about that. And also our use of internal records as evidence. We've begun citing that staff have reviewed internal records at a certain time and a date, and a certain staff person is named as having done that. This is part of our evolving learning about the best way to provide evidence. Some good feedback. We've only recently started doing that. Some good feedback on this one that could that internal records be a little more clear? Maybe we're going to explore, could we specify which internal records specifically are being reviewed? So if the board ever wanted to double check that, for example, with a third party, it would be quick and easy. So that's good feedback, and we appreciate that. Those were all parts of the sort of the methodological feedback and discussion of the service committee. We appreciated all those comments. I'm happy to answer any questions for the board at this time.
Yes, Jesse?
I just wanted to call out that a couple of board members had identified 221 as not having a timeline for compliance, and that was something that we looked at a little bit more closely. We did identify that that a timeline for compliance had been stated. It was just awkwardly positioned in the page, kind of buried in the middle of the evidence given, saying that the agency is working on retention efforts and expects to be compliant with this policy in the next monitoring period.
Thank you for that clarification, Jesse. I appreciate it. Are there any other questions from board members or concerns or comments on this report? Seeing none, Jesse, would you like to, as the chair of the service committee, give the motion as to what level you feel it should be accepted at?
Certainly, yes. So make a motion to accept this as be in compliance, except as noted by reasonable interpretation for all policy items, except for the CEO's stated non-compliance.
Do I have a second? Simi? Oh, sorry, Chris. All those in favor, please raise your hand. We are missing one board member, but we are still, we're missing Rich. But we're still in, okay, we still have quorum, so motion passed. Thank you so much, everyone. We will now move on to 6.1, treatment of the traveling public, which has been an ongoing process from the service committee. Jesse, on to you.
All right, and again, I want to apologize for not having appropriate materials ready for the board at the last meeting to discuss this. But many thanks to Rosa Maria, who put together the track change document, which is, I believe, page 86 of your packet, according to the page numbering, I guess it's, so yeah. If you look at that, I hope everyone's had a chance to look at this. There are, in my mind, only a few very strong material changes. There's the 211, the inclusion of the word bus stops in the definition of what we want to be covered in that policy. We are striking 212 and 214, and then the rest of the changes really have mostly to do with removing that shall not fail to sort of language that is considered out of, that's no longer good practice according to the Carver policy, and also renumbering.
Your attention, please. The library will close in 15 minutes. The internet stations will automatically shut off at 7:55. Please make any final copies at this time and take all materials to be checked out to a self-check station or to the circulation desk by 7:55. Thank you.
Without wanting to go through every single policy, I think I'll just, at this point, open it up to just defer to the rest of the board for discussion.
Do we have any questions? Yes, Monica.
Sorry. I just wanted to have definition for 2.1.1. Does bus stops also include shelters or just stops?
I think that will certainly be up to board interpretation, but I believe everything, in previous discussions with the board, the bus stops have included shelters, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to call this out, was that bus stops themselves were not, they were previously not part of the CEO's interpretation, and so things that didn't have a shelter, didn't have a sidewalk, that weren't handicap accessible, were not part of this policy. We wanted to bring that in. So I think the CEO will put forth an interpretation, but generally has included all of the structures and amenities associated with bus stops.
Yes, Monica.
So this will be my last question then. Because it can be defined, even though, thank you, Jesse, for defining it. Sometimes a bus stop is basically just where the sign is, right? But a shelter also can include a sign, obviously. I know we have QR signs in a lot of places where there's bus stops. But in the same aspect, a shelter to me is a bus stop, but it is also needing to, in my opinion, have its own definition included inside the policy. The reason why is because there are some areas that are still in need of shelters. And so because of that, I think it can be lost if it's just bus stops.
Well, I think this policy specifically refers to mobility limitations. So I don't know how, it may be worthwhile having if we want to discuss a policy saying that bus stops must have certain amenities, like that would be worthwhile, but I think that's outside the scope of what we were working on, because this specifically has to do with disability and mobility limitations.
And that's probably the last comment I will say on that. Basically, some folks with disability and mobility limitations actually do need the shelters. Because of the fact of weather conditions, what have you. If you're in a scooter, right, and you are impacted by rain or even snow, a shelter actually helps, especially when you're getting to the bus stop, in order to be able to even have the non-limitation of being able to enter the bus safely. So I just wanted to bring that up as a point, because at least if nothing else on the record, because I do think it's important that that is included.
Monica, I think that's a really very valid point that you've raised, and I also want to share that I know that one of the obstacles that we face in providing even bus pads, let alone shelters, is that I can't remember what the percentage rate is, Forrest may know, of areas that don't even have sidewalks. And so if there isn't a sidewalk to the bus stop, then it doesn't behoove us to put a pad or a shelter or whatever until that can be made known, and we don't really have the authority to go to our legal owners and say, you need to put a sidewalk here. But I completely understand your rationale, and I'm wondering if we were to change it from bus stops to bus stops and shelters. But in my mind, bus stops encompasses everything. So it's every bus stop, a bus stop that doesn't have a sidewalk, that does have a sidewalk, that does have a shelter. And I'm wondering, is that, you brought up the point, is that enough to know that, or do you still feel that there should be rationale to actually include shelter?
I would say, this is just one board member though, basically there should be a rationale to include shelters. This board member believes that, yes, bus stops has a very broad definition, and that can include shelters, but shelters basically also makes it defined.
Understood. Do we have any other discussion on what Monica has raised? Other board members, do you have comments or concerns? And so we'll leave that for now until we make the motion. Are there any other questions or concerns about the policy as written, the changes that have been recommended? I just want to say thank you for 2.1.4. It took me a minute. I had some real hard feelings about that. I'm like, wait, why would we want to eliminate that? And then I really realized that we have a global executive constraint that says, don't be imprudent, don't do anything illegal, don't, all the things that you can't do, which is what's summarized under 2.1.4, which then makes it redundant. So I appreciate the committee working hard on that as well. Are we ready for a motion then? And if we are we going to make a motion and entertain what Monica has suggested by amending the policy language as written, or do we need to make a motion that we want to have the policy as written? I haven't heard enough dialogue to support what Monica has said, but I also want to give her every opportunity to, well, she has been heard, but to see if it needs to be incorporated into the motion. Yes, Mike.
I see that Rose Mercier is with us on Zoom. I know she has talked quite a bit in the past, I believe, about making policy changes kind of on the fly like this. And I'll let her speak for herself, though.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I don't think, making an amendment is necessarily on the fly. I think it's taken some time. I mean, you could certainly take some time to consider it, but the majority appreciates it. It might ought to say bus stops and shelters. I mean, it makes it more specific. It narrows the range of interpretation that's available to the CEO. But I think if you were not including it, right, or saying, okay, I don't like it, we're just going to eliminate it, I think that's a very different kind of on the fly decision than what we're discussing. I think is more friendly than.
Thank you, Rose. Simi?
Yeah, just a question. Do we have any shelters that are not at bus stops? Don't coincide with those? Okay.
Mr. CEO is shaking his head no for those who can't see on.
In that case, I think between facilities and bus stops, it's pretty adequately covered. That would be my thought.
Would someone like to make a motion with regards to the policy as it's been presented with the changes? Yes, Susan.
I actually have another question. Boy, we're getting in the weeds here. So I just actually was using a shelter on my bus ride up here to the meeting because it was raining. And I guess the question has to do with all the issues related to using it. So they have to be compliant, not just for people in the scooters, but visually impaired and everything else. So I guess how we're looking at shelters, I guess my question is there anything about a shelter that would, I don't know, need to be called out? That it should be available to people of all abilities? I'm just asking it, just having just used one, is there an element of the structure that one has to be thinking about? The three-dimensionality, not the pad that you're on, but the actual glass box that you're standing in. Is there an element to that that needs to be called out? So a good example is they're tinted. Is that an issue about the glass box, the three-dimensional, that needs to be reviewed just to make sure that it meets a mobility need? Again, not the pad, I'm not dealing with the scooter, I'm just asking about the glass box that we stand in or use.
That would be, to me, a staff question with regards to what they take into consideration when they're putting in a shelter, but I don't know that that is germane to what we're talking about here. Maybe I'm not understanding what you're asking correctly.
I was trying to understand, because what we were speaking to is the facilities and the bus stops and the vehicles and the services. And I was just trying to understand, maybe most specifically, if you could help me to understand what you're getting at. Because if every stop is a stop, but only some have shelters, what you were trying to bring out with that point. I'm still confused what you were bringing to us.
So, so basically, two folds on this. Committee, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the word right, but Member Barr, I agree. There are basically bus stops with shelters. And there are bus stops without them. So when you're looking at, and I just go on a situation, this is a situation that I see frequently in my neighborhood, where we do have a shelter within West Willow. And it's a major route, basically in or out of West Willow. When it's raining, when people need, protection from the elements, whether it's sun, right, if it's hot, whether they need to actually put their bike under the shelter, because that way they can put their bike onto the bus system, whether that is people with limited mobilities, it makes a difference to all of those riders, right? And so that's what I was looking at and kind of defining it beyond just a bus stop, because we have bus stops too, right? Around the corner from that particular bus shelter, there's a bus stop. That bus stop in the area of a storm or, winter, might as well even say snow, sometimes we get snow, that can be a little bit more difficult for a person that may have mobility issues than being able to reach the shelter if they choose that bus stop in order to wait on the bus. So that's kind of like where I was defining it. Not only just, I think about people with mobility issues quite often because of the fact that, the nature of the business that I am in personally, but also we can also define that even with just basically having the proper protection, depending on, differing weather situations. So I don't want to belabor it if if the board feels that bus stops is adequate. I don't, but in the same aspect, the direction of the board carries in the end. So that's how I'll kind of end it.
Yes, Jesse.
I think if we were to add the word shelter to the policy, it would be saying that we would be specifying that the shelters themselves need to be accessible whether or not they exist. I think the question of whether or not a bus stop is accessible if it doesn't have a shelter is more of a question that we ask when we are looking at this policy. So I think there's a place to talk about like what amenities need to be included at a bus stop in order to be accessible, and that's a really important question, one that we've talked about a lot. But as far as this question, even if we were to add the word shelter, we would just be asking, is the shelter itself accessible? We wouldn't actually be, I think, accomplishing what you're hoping that it would. We would just, because the policy wouldn't be saying, and must include a shelter. So. Because if we insert the word shelter, it would say that the CEO shall not allow facilities, bus stops, shelters, et cetera, to lack reasonable accessibility. We're saying that the shelter can't lack accessibility. Just inserting the word shelter into this policy doesn't actually say that bus stops must include shelters.
Mike, you had your hand up?
I mean, I certainly understand the discussion, and I certainly appreciate Monica's point that shelters are important too. But I'm concerned that we're kind of going down a rabbit hole, and if we start doing it on this, I mean, vehicles, should we start talking about different types of vehicles? Should we start talking about other kinds of facilities, services? I mean, and that's just on this one sub-policy. I mean, if we kind of have this idea that every time we look at a policy or monitor a policy that we should try to fine-tune it more beyond what seems, at least to me, to be pretty reasonable. I don't think that's I feel good that that's the way that we should be going. Last time we monitored this, we talked about facilities do or do they not include bus stops. And okay, now we're including bus stops, but now we're trying to refine that even further. And then we might be thinking about doing it for other points. And I have to say I'm concerned about this direction.
Yes, Monica.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, the board will basically vote the way that they do on this policy. I definitely understand that. My concerns have been brought out on the record, and I think that is the point of my concerns. So I wanted to make sure as a board member, it was brought out on the record.
Thank you, Monica. With all of this excellent dialogue, do we have a motion with regards to the policy as it's written? Yes, Jesse.
I'd like to move that we amend policy 2.1 to match the proposed language in our packet.
Is there a second? Yes, Chris. Is there any further dialogue? Seeing none, let's take a vote. All those in favor, please raise your hand. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 7 in favor and 1 not. How many are nay? Let's make it official. Sorry about that. Yes, Monica, thank you. So 7 are in favor, 1 is nay, but we are still, that still passes. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work on that. I appreciate it. For people who may be wondering, Dr. Gerber is with us today, and because she is coming from us from Zoom, that prevents her from voting a quorum under the Open Meetings Act. So I just wanted to sort of loop everybody in on that we're not ignoring you, Dr. Gerber. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. A minute. Next on our agenda is the policy development on the sustainability policy, and that is Ms. Pauley, Mr. Barr, and Dr. Gerber.
Yeah, thank you. we were excited to bring the policy brief you have in your packet before you all last month, and had a discussion about that. In the month since, we asked to solicit any feedback that you had written if board members wanted to provide that, and we didn't receive any. So we wanted to come back. We have the CEO with us tonight, so if there are questions that people would like to direct at him as to how this potential new policy would impact the CEO's responsibilities, we can ask those questions, have a short discussion, and then we're thinking of motioning for to bring this policy into fruition in the ends of the organization. So I'll just review that there was one piece of policy language that we actually proposed. That was the AAATA will work to become a carbon neutral organization. That would go in the ends policies. There were two proposals that are highlighted on packet page 89. One would be replacing policy 1.2.2 with that language, or the second option would be adding this in addition to the other language. We can discuss that as well. My proposal at this point is to go with number 2, to add it, to have additional language, just so we're not doing away with policy that we've had for a while, and we'll have the opportunity to, once we start seeing monitoring reports, to modify if necessary. So I'm happy to open it up for board discussion and any questions.
Thank you, Simi. Do we have any questions from the board? Yes, Mike.
I really don't have a question. I just wanted to compliment the 3 board members who took the initiative to bring this up. It's an important issue, and they did it in a very good way, very thoughtful way. And I think that's really a nice thing for the board to be doing. Actually, my preference, Simi, would be number 1, because it seems like the existing policy, what's being proposed is really more comprehensive than the existing policy, and it could be replaced, but I don't have a strong preference either way, frankly.
Do we have any other conversation? Oh, hello, sorry. Did you have something, Dr. Gruber?
I was just gonna point out that Ms. Mercier has her hand up.
Oh, Rose, I'm sorry. It's a yellow hand on your books, and I'm so sorry that I don't see it. Go ahead, Rose.
Unmute, yes. I have a sneaking hunch I might have been sent this, but we were transitioning to Teams and I lost some emails and stuff in the interim. So my comment, I'm going to throw a wrench into this, is as it's stated, it's not really an end. I mean, ends policies are not about the organization itself. They're about the impact the organization creates external to the organization. So I know these are really important values, and we've had this conversation quite well the last few months. I think it's figuring out where that value is best expressed, and so that's my comment. The moment is, it's not an end policy. It is really important, but really important things can be in a variety of policies. It could be, it could be part of executive limitations in a variety of places.
So in reviewing these policies and our meetings regarding this, we identified sustainability language in a number of places, and including the value statements and executive limitations. And we felt that because of the overarching nature of the goal that the ends was the most logical location for that to be found, and there's a little more about that in the policy brief section. So that's how we determined the location, being one that overarches the entire organization, rather than getting more granular in the executive limitations. In the current executive limitations, the only mention of environmental policy is in a construction policy, and it's pretty sort of limited. So the idea was to get a more broad policy. I think, we can talk about modifying the language here, but I think at least within our committee, we found the ends to be the location that we saw most fit.
So, and I probably don't want to get into a long debate about this, but it's just that just because something is overarching or is an overarching value doesn't necessarily mean that it fits within an ends policies, because ends are always about what impact the organization is going to create for whom, right? And at what cost. But I look at this and saying the organization will work towards it. It's about the organization. And so it's not really an ends policy. And when I think about how you interpret that, you end up talking about there's a lot of activities or a lot of initiatives or strategies that will contribute to that, but all of those will be means, right? So it's thinking about, if you're carbon neutral, who benefits, right? And what's that benefit? Yeah.
Liz,
Can I ask a question?
of course.
So, Rose, can you make a suggestion about how we would accomplish this value, not in a way that you consider to be consistent with policy governance? Because this is a very important value.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Whatever, you're the expert on how we do it. What we really don't want to do is derail this effort, because we do believe that those within at least a large segment, I don't know if it's everybody on the board, but plenty of the board members and lots and lots and lots and lots of people and stakeholders in the community care about exactly this thing. So what would be a real shame is to say, well, because we do policy governance, we can't pursue this very important value. So whatever, can you please make a, help us, make a suggestion about how do we, if this isn't where the policy goes, Simi and Susan and I did think that this seemed like an end, but if you don't believe that, can you advise us as to where it does go in policy? Because we don't believe that current policy is sufficient to reflect this value.
So the way to get at that, because I'm not the environmental expert, is to say, if you're thinking about how the organization achieves carbon, right? If you want that, is to say, when I think about this, is so what would be unacceptable as actions, strategies, or situations or decisions that would contribute to the opposite of what would be actions or strategies that you wouldn't engage in if in fact this was value pursuing.
Can I ask a question? Because, so I'm I'm confused. 1.2.2 says specifically, public transportation options minimize energy use and pollution and conserve natural resources. We're already saying that's what we want public transportation to do. To me, adding the language 1.2.5 that we will become a carbon neutral organization, to me is a smaller bucket going into the larger bucket of what was said in 1.2.2. So I concur with Simi and the group that it's an ends and a value statement, and perhaps, as Mike just pointed out to me, the word will work is what is the stumbling block, because that is a meansy thing, and possibly AATA will become a carbon neutral organization and eliminate the word work. Would that
You see, the challenge, it's not the challenge, is that ends are intended to describe results created outside the organization because the organization exists. They're not intended to describe what the organization will become, right? So when you have as the subject of the organization will become, it's not an end.
Yes, Simi, and then Monica, and then Jesse.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I just have, I think my first question on what are ends has been a little bit defined. I would like to hear that again. But then secondly, okay, so I'm assuming, because the question I wrote down is what does this mean, right? Who are we doing this for? Are we doing this for the AATA, for the ridership of the AATA, both? I just want to make sure that I'm being clear that I appreciate the subcommittee's work on this policy. I just wanted to get those two questions answered because I think it's important for, to recognize the committee's work. That's the first thing. But yeah, what does this actually mean? Because carbon neutral, and I see a little bit in the policy, but I just like to know what words mean.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. So as far as who is this for, we looked back at the communities that stakeholders and our owners. So the city of Ann Arbor, the city of Ypsilanti both have carbon neutrality goals of their own, as well as stakeholders like the University of Michigan. So it's really a broadly held value in the community, as well as a value for the organization. We have not specifically carbon neutrality, but environmental stewardship is one of our first values. As far as what it means to be carbon neutral is your emissions of carbon balance out how much you're taking out of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, like many others. Gases like methane are measured in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So though carbon neutral sounds really specific, it's really talking about your greenhouse gas neutral. We're going to work to eliminate the greenhouse gas impact of the organization. So one of the issues with 1.22 that I originally had was it really focuses more, in my opinion, on the vehicles themselves than the organization as a whole. And that was part of what we wanted to touch on with this policy. So I'm happy to answer further if you've got further questions.
Jesse, go ahead.
All right, so I have a question and then a follow-up after it. So hearing that the agency will work, why that doesn't really fit as an end statement. Do you have similar concerns about all the other ends policies? Sorry, this is to Rose. Do you have similar concerns about the other policies that say, like public transportation will such and such? Because we have a lot of policies that say that public transportation will do this.
Yeah. Well, I think I have less concerns about those. I mean, I think we've, second, I just, and, oops, sorry. I have both things open at the time. I think it's not, when what you're saying is that public transportation, right? So we're saying, here's we'll do this. There's
So we say, like,
somebody
public
who's a beneficiary, right?
I was saying, so we say like public transportation positively impacts our environment. Public transportation options are increasingly chosen. We do call out public transportation. We don't just say like that transportation options are like, we kind of identify ourselves, our scope as being a public transportation
I mean,
organization.
you could, if you choose, so this is really off the top of my head, is, I mean, you could say, public transportation options contribute to carbon neutrality. I mean, if you,
Well, so that was kind of my follow-up. If we, reworded it to public transportation options are carbon neutral.
could do that.
Yes, Susan.
One of the things, though, that we're trying to accomplish with this is to go beyond just the mobility piece and to address the overall operations of the organization. So not only buses, which is on the public side, but also vehicles and buildings and construction processes and so on, all contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And so, so I think just talking about public transit options does not reflect the level of importance that this value is intended to reflect.
I think in hearing you describe some of what, some of the things that contribute, right? So whether it's construction or it's operations or it's whatever, those are all, if you will, means of the organization. And that's why I've said before is that if they're all related to the means that the organization uses, then what you want to do is address this value sort of either comprehensively through all the executive limitations where that's relevant, or, and this is once again just off the top of my head, is you could create an executive limitation area that relates to environmental sustainability, right? And put all of the things related to that in a single limitation. I mean, it may be a way to call attention to that. If part of this is in terms of what it communicates to the communities in which we operate, right? And making it sort of visible as a policy that focuses strictly on environmental sustainability. You could write an executive limitation that does that. I mean, so.
Monica had her hand up first and then Susan.
Thank you. This would be my actually final comment. It's not really a question per se. So again, I appreciate the committee's work. I just don't know that a broad aspect of Ypsilanti, my community in Ypsilanti Township would actually know what that means. And so that would be my concern. Again, I just like to emphasize that the board, obviously, the decision of the board is a decision of the board, and that was what will override. But I'm not sure about if they know that. And so that would be a concern of this board member.
Susan.
So I'm going to go back to the question that Liz asked earlier, Rose. As you know, we've been meeting with you for months, and I feel like it's a whack-a-mole process that whatever we come up with, you say, nope, that's not it, and nope, that's not it. And I'm expressing frustration because for me, this is now many, many months of proposing ideas and language. And once again, tonight, I'm frustrated to hear, nope, that's not it. And I guess I missed some emails. So I would ask if we could all, as a committee and with you, commit the work in the next few weeks to actually come up with language that you feel is appropriate to policy governance, that we could bring back to the board for dialogue. And again, it's the goal of having this in front of the board for action. I resonate very much with what my colleagues have said. I hear this as an important issue, and you use the word repeatedly in your first comments about impact. I can't think of anything that we're doing that has more impact than this.
Yeah.
And I think it's time that we stop playing with words and actually come up with something we can all work with. Again, with all due respect, I'm frustrated. Between us in the next few weeks, if we can come up with something to bring back to the board, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I will absolutely commit to doing this.
So if I'm hearing everything correctly, we've had a lot of hearty dialogue this evening. We are not going to be voting on the language as presented because of all the other issues that have been brought up this evening. The Sustainability Task Force will meet somewhere over the next few weeks with Rose Mercier to come up with a amenable solution to verbiage and where it needs to be housed, either under ELs or the Ns. And we will hear back from you all in August, and if not August, for sure in September, but we are aiming for August, correct? All right, thank you everybody for all of your work, for all your questions, and we appreciate it. And I can't thank the committee enough for all the work. I know you've been working since, I believe it's January, when this really hearty discussion began, and it's been a long row to hoe. I'm not sure that was appropriate, I'm sorry. But meaning that a lot of work has gone into this process. It's been a very long, laborious process, but I feel like we're getting to the end. I'm seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, so thank you, everyone. All right, we're going to move on then to the budget education. There are several layers to what is getting ready to happen right now, and I want to give everyone some context and some history. I need to find my notes, one moment. So after some discussion at the governance committee level, we determined that since the adoption of policy governance in 2017, the board has really not revisited our budget process for our agency with regards to our role and how it has evolved over time. We have a significant number of new appointees, and we are at the beginning of the budget process now. And so it seems to be the perfect time for the board to receive education on the subject. It's important to note that this education is coming to you twofold. One, Mr. Carpenter, our CEO, is going to present on the evolution of the budget process. He is the one who has been here through the entire time, so he can give you the operational side of everything, which I think is important for us to understand, from the pre-policy governance model to the model that we use today. And then secondly, we're going to hear from our governance coach, Rose Mercier, and she's going to talk about the mechanisms we use to arrive at and accept our successful budget within the realms of policy governance, and how our board has challenged the Carver method and adopted it in a different way. So thank you everyone for that. And I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Carpenter, who has a PowerPoint presentation for us.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I've been asked, as Ms. Mozak said, to just give a very brief rundown of the history of our budgeting processes. So very quick, historically our budget has been, I would say prior to policy governance, very similar to what many of you have probably seen in other organizations, institutions, and municipalities nearby. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the characteristics of that more what I would call traditional approach, but it tends to be very focused on the preferences of individual board members, city councilors, decision makers. We operated that way for many years. Unfortunately, at some point in the past, this led to a bit of, shall I say, horse trading or haggling, and the result of that was by 2014, the agency was beginning to slide into a deficit situation. Thankfully, because of the millage last year in 2022, that's no longer a sort of an ongoing concern. The financial future is bright, but it is, I think, notable that from 2014 to 2024 is a 10-year span. So that's a considerable amount of time where finances were a concern for us. Policy governance, when it was discussed and introduced in 2017, was seen, at least partially, as a corrective action to help us not fall back into habits that had created some of our financial challenges in the past. Today, TheRide uses what I will call in this presentation a hybrid approach for budget. It is a blend of what policy governance says budgets should do and can do, and our more traditional approaches here in Washtenaw County and in the municipal sector. It is different from other local approaches, and it may not be familiar. I think this is something I agree with the governance committee about. We haven't explicitly talked about this with board members probably since 2018. And we have a lot of faces around here that weren't here at that time. So it's definitely past due for an update. So I'm going to, at the risk of vastly oversimplifying a regular budgeting process, the budget approval in many organizations is not just a financial mechanism, it's also partially a strategic decision-making process. That major decisions happen in the budgeting process. That is a very traditional approach. You see that in the yellow box here above the approved decision. That's the action. That's where the action happens traditionally, is in that budget process. Policy governance identifies budgets as just another means document. It's an organization of resources, of activities about how something will be executed. And it challenges boards to say the value that a board can really provide is actually earlier in setting those priorities in advance. End statements are the outcomes that you want to achieve in the community, what you do for whom and at what cost. Doing that during the budgeting process can get a little tense. Doing that in advance can be a bit more esoteric, a bit more conceptual, but it helps give everyone a sense of the collective direction, the will of the board. Same thing with your executive limitations. Those form your effectively budgeting parameters, how we must develop the budget. At each of your places is a red book, which is just a booklet for you to take, but inside of that is a sheet of paper with two policy areas on it. The first side is your ends policies, 2.0, or 1.0, excuse me. The second is your policy 2.4, financial planning and budgeting. Though it's from your executive limitations. Those two sets of policies together are what the board has approved and the direction that you have given me and staff as to how the budget will be created. So that's what the board has already said in the blue box in advance to staff. So a little bit of side by side here. On the traditional method, as I said, very focused on individual votes. Someone in my position might be going around talking to individual council members, trustees, whatever the situation is, trying to figure out what combination of permutation of a financial presentation would be enough to get enough votes to pass. That's kind of the traditional method. Policy governance says, how about using your collective direction? You as a board make a decision in advance about what it is you want the agency to accomplish and the how being the executive limitations. We don't really haggle as much. I don't haggle anymore with you as a board. It's more about, you've told me already what your collective expectations are in these policies. You say jump, I say how high in those policies. Have we met your expectations? In a traditional approach, there can be a lot of fingers sort of in the process. A budget proposal, the details of it, the amount of it, the deadlines, the FTEs, all of that can be subject to debate, popularity discussions. In policy governance setting, that is supposed to be delegated to professional staff who are accountable to you. I am answerable to you. If any of those things go sideways, it's on me. So, but there's one point of contact. There's no question about how did this go right or wrong. Monitoring, you have a very formal monitoring process, including going back and saying, how did our outcomes, or did we achieve them? How well did we achieve them? And this is a final point. I think it's very important. In a traditional budgeting process, despite white papers and policy statements and approvals ahead of time, the agency, the organization really doesn't know a board's priorities until the budget is finished, because anything could happen in that process. Your priorities are an outcome or an output of the budgeting process. In policy governance, the budget is more of an implementation tool. I should already know your priorities. I should already know what you have collectively said through your policies. The budget becomes more of an the goals, your ends, become more of an input. The budget is more of a tool for implementation or execution. We've already had the important conversations in advance about what do you want, what conditions would be unacceptable even if they worked. So it's a little difference between proactive and reactive. Now my slide is washed out, but beneath those two things is a slightly green box where yellow and blue come together and make green about our hybrid approach. And this is what we've evolved here. What we do and have been doing since about 2018 is mostly policy governance, but with I think, an important caveat that is still very familiar, I think, to local decision makers. You do set your collective directions via your policies, those ones I gave you just a moment ago. Those are what Dina and I use to craft the budget. Those are your marching orders to me. Again, I don't go around asking any of you what should be included in the budget. You've already told me collectively. And again, delegated to professional staff. But board members can still vote on the individual budget. This has resulted in a two-step approval process for us. This is something we've done every year for the last 2 years. Budget approval happens in 2 steps. First step, after reviewing the budget, you get the monitoring report for policy 2.4. This is what you said the budget had to do. Did we do that, yes or no? And as with any monitoring report, you decide whether or not to accept it. The second step, which comes after, is that you vote on the budget. So that's, again, the policy governance and the traditional approach together. Now, this has worked in a lot of ways. Our financial position has drastically improved since these changes were brought in, but it has brought in, I think, some challenges that are worth discussing. First of all, the process is not familiar. It seems a little cumbersome, may not be intuitive, may not be the way other institutions nearby do things. And there is, I think, an inherent tension in this between the collective direction you give me as a body through your approved policies and your individual preferences, which we all have. We need to be just right up front about that. There's no shame in that. There's nothing wrong in that. But there's a tension in here about how those two things are reconciled. So we have a number of tools at our disposal to try to begin to reconcile this. One of the most important, I think, is the business planning process, which we haven't discussed in a couple of months, but I wanted to share a little bit more about the intent of that tool. It is a bridge. It does a lot of things, I should say. It's an organization tool, an alignment tool, a planning tool, a communications tool, but one of the most important functions it does, it's a bridge between what you have collectively told me and your individual preferences. If your policies are at a 30,000 foot level, I can bring the plane down to 15,000 feet in the business plan, show you this is what's going to be driving the budget next year. Here are the projects, here are the major initiatives, here are the big gears moving. And I ask you for advice, as I am free to do from anybody, including you. Tell me what you think of it, to gauge your reaction. In the past, this has been very helpful in surfacing individual concerns from board members that we're able to address, accommodate, say, oh, you know what, great, that's actually addressed in this policy. I'm sorry, it's not clear. We can handle that and still be on side with what the board's expectations have been. So it's worked, I think, very well, but the key is it works, it's intended to work early. What we don't want is to get to September, maybe 72 hours before the end of the fiscal year, when we legally have to have the budget approved, and then discover we all misunderstood each other about what the budget should contain. Those are difficult days, those are long nights with spreadsheets and not entirely satisfying. So the business plan is part of that process to help surface, understand, and hopefully reconcile your collective direction and individual needs, or preferences, I should say. So in closing very quickly, the board still exercises a lot of control. I want to be clear about this. You delegate means to your professional staff, yes, but we are accountable to you. There are 3 main ways you as a body steer the budgeting process, as well as, I think, pretty much every process. Collectively, you identify your goals, your strategic goals, you want to call them, your end statements is what the policy governance terminology. It's the outcomes, it's the benefits, the results you want to have. That's a collective decision that you decide and send to me, so there's no confusion on my part. You clarify the budgeting parameters, not how I will do it, but how I cannot do it, which is the executive limitations processes, which gives me a wide field to do it in the way I think is best, using the professional judgment we have. So that's collectively. You're in, of course, the accountability and monitoring report are there as well. Individual feedback to the CEO in the business plan. I am asking you for your advice, and it's been very helpful in making sure we're heading in a direction that everyone can agree with. And then finally, as an individual, yes, you vote. It is legally required in the state of Michigan that the board approve the budget. You could do that in a consent agenda after receiving a monitoring report, but we continue to vote on it individually. And there will always, as long as we do, I suspect we'll always have a bit of a tension here between the collective direction and the delegation of policy governance and the natural and healthy individual aspirations that many people have. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to you and Rose. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. We're going to move on to Rose Mercier, and then when we're done with the presentation, we'll leave it open to questions, okay? Hi, Rose.
Hello.
Welcome. Thank you.
So I think my presentation is going to sound a lot like Matt's, but probably in just a more general way. So I am going to share my screen and just so let's try this. Okay, there we go. And this is really more from I think a general educational point of view, not specific to AATA, but it certainly applies. I mean, and I think what Matt is describing is not unlike what I'm going to speak to, which is, I think, part of what's tried to look at here is just really reinforcing that budgets are management tools. They're plans, and like plans, they change. How the board governs finance as opposed to managing it, how you use those policies, and looking a little bit at a more traditional approach, something that you might see in other organizations, and some of the flaws that creates that I think Matt has already alluded to. And looking at how the board describes what would be unacceptable budget, and therefore what ahead of time can we say that would make a budget unacceptable and we couldn't approve it. So, it's essentially what I'm going to cover. So I think this probably visually depicts what Matt said, which is that the board actually uses two, well, is thinking of this as a management tool, that the board, that staff develop the budget within the boundaries for the use of resources as defined by the board. So it already speaks to, the budget includes technology, facilities, staff, services, etc. There is already a pretty comprehensive set of policies that say anything included in the budget needs to effectively and efficiently harness resources to achieve by ends, which you have defined as, you know, as a collective. If you think about this, is budget just this tool that's driving the organization towards the results you want to achieve, that you predetermined you want. So that's already known when the staff set out to develop a budget. Hang on a second. Is this, I just want to move. Okay. So some of the in traditional budget approval, I think some of the questions would be, is why would a board wait until the meeting to emphasize something that it wants to make happen, or something that it wants to? We've probably all lived through board meetings that are like that. We get the budget and it's just, you know, it's the major activity of the year. And we start to talk about what we like, don't like, how we want to change it. And so what sometimes can happen in that is that the louder voices may prevail, and the board and as a whole ends up, if you will, relinquishing its right to make a decision as a whole, because either it gets tired of arguing, or the individuals speaking are very convincing. And what that leaves the CEO doing is trying to read the minds of board members ahead of time, instead of using the experience, the creativity to make decisions that already comply with what the board has said. And I think that's, I often say this, is that it seems silly for organizations and find, you know, competent, experienced, creative CEOs, and then not give them a field in which to operate and apply that. So what you want is it that a board needs to, in fact, I mean, it's part of the, you know, if you will, fiduciary duties of boards is to ensure that there is a duty of care that's given, and in the area of finances is one of those areas. And it's not, if you will, responsibly governing finance by looking, pouring through pages of budgets and financial reports and spending hours looking at those details, but it's being really clear upfront, what constitutes fiscal deficit, and how do we put in place mechanisms that in fact prevent it, should occur, right, discovered as soon as possible. So how do we in fact define what would be unacceptable, because in fact what it would do is produce fiscal deficit, right? So governing financial management is pretty simple. The board wants to make sure that financial decisions, actions, circumstances turn out the way that it wants, or don't turn out the way it doesn't want, if you will. So you need to really state clearly, specifically, authoritatively, what you want to be avoided, and not skip that step in deciding whether or not you like what you end up getting, right? So it's saying in advance what you, the boundaries, right, within which that budget is set, and also, what it should seek to achieve. So with that ensures that while individual board members' opinions matter and influence what's happening, and I think, the process that actually gives a really good example of how that happens. But that those opinions really are part of the deliberation of the board as a whole, in choosing the criteria that it wants to set for financial management. So the board states what it wants avoided, right? It's in a very broad way, right? It's saying allow practices, activities, decisions, etc., that are unlawful, imprudent, in violation of commonly accepted business practice or professional ethics. And then taking that further and saying, when it comes to matters of finance in the organization, we're gonna say more about what we consider to be imprudent or unethical in the areas of financial planning, financial conditions and activities, asset protection, and investment. And so it doesn't say the budget's more important than any of those areas. They are all collectively important in ensuring that we do not risk sustainability. So it deliberates those values, and it decides not what decisions and actions should occur, but really what decisions and actions. Probably pretty familiar with that. And I apologize for my voice. The smoke has triggered my asthma, and I am losing my voice every day. So with respect to boards and budgets, sometimes you have the time-honored tradition. I mean, I've been part of boards. I've worked for boards with this, is that we go through line of the budget prior to approving it, even though we maybe lose the big picture in it, because budgets aren't perfect. They're always adjusted. So what we're approving today may shift or change, but within the context of using the policy boundaries, it could change. Right? Reallocate things, but at the end of the day, it still operates within those boundaries. So it's those principles and values that are used to shape those boundary policies that in fact are important, not necessarily the numbers in and of themselves, right? It's the numbers are important, but they're important only as a manifestation of those principles. So some of the flaws, if you will, in traditional budget approval is that the board develops criteria, as we talked about, on the spot. It looks for errors or oversights in those lines, the lines, whether it's looking at line by line or category by category or bottom line. And so the CEO then has to guess what the board might be looking for in bringing a budget. So as we've said, sometimes board members in attendance or not in attendance may influence those criteria that are within the meeting. And so the approval process may not be the, if you will, reflection of full board's criteria, but we want to try and not have that happen. So if you think about this, is the real question, right, that you want to be thinking about when you develop or when you set boundaries is, what would make the budget unacceptable? Why would we not approve a budget? And so that's when you start to look at what you say. And so the board's already said a lot about this, and I think you've looked at this, but you've already said about the budget, right? Is that here's what would make any of the situations described below, right, are unacceptable. So I'm not going to read all of these, but if the budget is derived from actions that would jeopardize federal and state funding, if it projects tax revenue that isn't aligned with the tax, if revenues from if the budget projects revenues from the acquisition, mortgaging, or sale of real estate, it wouldn't be acceptable. So those are a number of things that you say. If any of these, any budget that we approve, none of this can be part of that budget. And then you're using, the monitoring report or direct inspection, which partly budgets often are, is there evidence that in fact, none of these in fact are in place? And similarly, you've added a variety of other things as if the budget is not, if it deviates from the board's ends priorities, risks jeopardies, or isn't derived from a multi-year strategy, it would be unacceptable. And further, here's what we mean by that. Here's further detail, right? We're saying the budget doesn't disclose the assumptions on which it's planned, it would be unacceptable. If the budget doesn't separate capital and operational items, it would be unacceptable. If it's unclear about long-term funding needs and growth projections, it would be unacceptable. So the board at some point in time, probably early on in terms of its writing of policies in this, asked itself, what would make a budget unacceptable, and documented those. So that becomes, if you will, that outer fence within which the budget needs to be developed. That you monitor use the monitoring report and the data in the monitoring report to assess whether in fact the budget's compliant with all of those conditions that you've set ahead of. Doesn't mean you can't change them. You can always change them at any time. Right. And so if the question is always, I know this is probably a bit moot, because if monitoring demonstrates that the budget's in compliance with all of the applicable board policy criteria, there's really no reason for a board to not approve the budget, right? Yes, but so we have state law requires that the board approve the budget and actually have a vote. And so what you're able to say is that the monitoring demonstrates that the budget is compliant with all of our criteria. There's no reason for us not to approve it. We can approve it. You can use, I think Matt called it a consent agenda. You can use a required approvals agenda if you wish. Those are techniques you can use. But I think the bottom line part of this is if the budget's compliant with all of the criteria that you've established, there's no reason to not approve it. Right. And so the board really is setting, boundary setting is really sound financial governance. It's the board exercises financial steward by translating values about prudence and ethics into boundaries and rigorously monitoring for compliance. The board clarifies its values in those areas of financial, sets boundaries and descending levels of detail, which and clearly defines what's unacceptable. That allows the CEO to understand the range of authority. So you're not trying to be a mind reader and try to understand or consider, okay, will this be acceptable or not? It's declared ahead of. Yeah. Anyway, so that's kind of the overview, and so I think we're now open for questions, insights. I'm going to stop. Okay.
Thank you, Rose. I'm going to open it up to the board. Do you have questions for either? It would be appropriate to talk with Matt or Ms. Messier at this time. Yes, Susan.
So just to clarify, because there's an external responsibility to have an approved budget, is the correct language that we bring forward that resolved, we see no reason not to approve this board. We found no reason to not approve it. That would be sort of in keeping with what you've been saying, that if we've given direction, then we find no reason not to approve it would be the correct language under policy governance? Because we're
Yeah,
not officially approving
yeah.
it. We're saying the negative, we see no reason not to approve it. Is that the correct way?
I think that's the conclusion you might draw, but the motion should probably say that the board approves the budget, and I'm gonna think that actually, and I would need to correct this, but state legislation often requires that approval be recorded in the minutes, and so what you want to do is in fact say you approve the budget.
And then one other thing, the budget is also a way of communicating to the larger world. You're stating it as just a financial document. And in fact, it is a really important document that ties together a lot of pieces. You know, and Matt spoke to the business plan, and I kind of want to go back to that. Where I had challenges last process with the last budget was I didn't feel we had been as descriptive as I felt I needed to be to understand what the year looked like. And a good example, I was very concerned about ridership. And I didn't feel for myself that there was a lot of content on how we were going to build ridership this year. And what I saw was, well, there's money for new ride guide publishing, or you know, that kind of thing, and which to my mind wasn't going to do a whole lot to jumpstart the ridership increase. So I think it's more than just a series of numbers. I think it's also how we're communicating, how we're making progress toward the millage goals, how we are making progress to our long-range plan, how we are striving in these ways, and these numbers get us that much further. So I want to at least challenge you that this is just a budget document, and that if it meets these, then we've done our job. Because I think how we communicate what the numbers mean is as important as the numbers themselves. At least for me, I think that that's how the approach I'm taking, at least in my view, with a budget is I don't want to micromanage what the numbers are. I trust staff completely. But what I'm trying to get at is how is this moving us forward? When we face our community again in 3 years on the millage, did we make progress? Well, here's how all the ways in which we're communicating on our long-range plan. So it's the how of the communication that go beyond the numbers.
Yeah.
You know, that I'm challenging. I think the how the budget is presented, the verbiage is as important as the numbers. And maybe I have that all wrong. I guess I need to hear how policy governance might view that.
Yeah, I think that we're probably, if we could maybe disentangle this a bit, I think that budgets are really a management tool. I absolutely agree that how you translate that which is within the budget into what does this look like, if you will, in real life, in terms of here's the kinds of things that we're doing, here's how this is advancing towards our ends, etc., is really another part of that exercise of communicating that outwards, right? So I'm just trying to separate out the two. I mean, I appreciate that the impact that a budget has in terms of realizing the results that you've said need to be happen. But in just looking at strictly in the approving of the budget process, it's really saying, does this actually link to the results that we said? And or anything that we think would create fiscal jeopardy there. Okay, so we can approve the budget, right? The content, and I think this is maybe more from Matt's, probably for Matt to talk about in terms of how they use the business plan, how that gets translated into, as I call it, outside facing language, right? That helps explain, you know, what's in the budget, what the impact is, you know, for the residents.
Yes, Monica.
Hi. I agree with Susan. Basically, in more so of Yes, there is a fiscal responsibility to approve a budget, for sure. The organization cannot operate without one, so a budget does have to be approved. However, as a member of the body, I also would need to, if a constituent comes up and asks me about why did this get done, I should be able to explain it besides giving them a broad indication of, well, this is it. So I so I get both ends, but I just want to make sure that what Susan said is also valued, because we will, as board members, maybe get questions about why did this happen or what was the rationale for that. And if you don't know, besides a broad explanation, you're not going to be able to explain it, and that's not a good thing. So
Yeah.
I just want to concur Susan's comment.
I suspect that some of that is, and maybe Matt can elaborate on this, part of that is in the business planning part of that, is that it gives that sort of language that I call, outside facing language, which is, what's in the budget and what is it intended to do? What are we going to accomplish, right? Like, but that budget's still it's just a tool to make those things happen. But explaining that, right? Like, so there's a difference between, if you will, the financial stewardship role of the board, right? And the if you will, the representing of what the board is doing and what the organization is doing back to back to the community. That's a kind of a different tool, if you will. Both important.
Matt, did you want to say anything to this?
A couple things I can offer. Absolutely, a budget can be a PR tool. There's no question about that. There's no question that a board member should be able to explain any part of it that they may want. The way we've handled those things in the past is when a budget is finalized, and the board does vote on it, it is approved. I think I said that in my comments, but I want to reiterate it. If any member wants briefings on any part of that, any nuance of it, any detail of it, why do shelters go here and not there, we are more than happy to sit down with that person any amount of time to make sure any nuance is explained to their satisfaction. If they want to interact with their constituents directly, that is absolutely a board member prerogative. If they would like any wingmen along to help them out, we're happy to tag along and be the resource. In terms of overall public relations, external affairs, if you will, that is something broadly delegated to staff. We have used the budget and annual reports about the budget in the past to that effect. Could we do more of it to make a more impactful statement about what TheRide stands for and what it's doing in the community? Absolutely. That's turning the budget into a PR tool. Before then, though, is still the question of how do you collectively give direction to the organization about what that budget should be about? Is it horse trading and looking at hundreds of lines of details? Or do you want to set broadly the goals you want this agency to achieve, the outcomes? Make sure these things happen. It's your decision. It's not my decision. I want to be clear about it. It's your decision. You're discussing it tonight. Do you want to set clear policies about, and this is, I think, the nuance that's getting lost here. You want the agency to perform at a high level. You've acknowledged with policy governance that professional staff are part of the way to do that, and that kneecapping them will not help your cause. So you want to delegate to your staff to let them do what they do, but you don't want to let me run all over the place. Oversight is important. Accountability is important. How do you do that? You decide what I cannot do, even if it were to work. Those are your executive limitations. In the past, you have policies today that say, don't create debt. Don't go into debt to fund operations. Don't create unfunded future liabilities. Don't sell real estate without board approval. High level, not the granular details, the high level parameters about how you collectively govern, and I like that point, govern the process. When we get to the approval process, Susan, this is where that two-step process kicks in. The first one is a monitoring report. Did we meet your collective expectations? It looks like every other monitoring report we give you, except obviously with a lot more budget numbers. The second part is obviously your individual vote. The business plan process, as I tried to describe it, is an attempt to get at, we're at a 30,000 foot level, you've collectively given me your big stuff. Okay, what's next? Where are those little things? And I want to agree with Susan, the business plan has not yet hit it out of the park in terms of ridership growth. As Rosa and other staff know, I've been harping on that a lot recently, and I hope to bring you something that is much more convincing in that space. Last year, when we got to September and there was a question about the type of HVAC system we were going to be installing, Dina and I had a moment of looking at each other, realizing we don't even have that information here with us. We're not prepared to answer that question in September because we were going on your collective directions. We were running down that field of this is what the board expects from us. So we were caught unprepared in that moment. I would love to hear those sorts of concerns earlier, and I think you would like to hear each other's concerns even more, because a simple question about an HVAC system can reveal a whole universe of values about environmental sustainability that really warrant a policy decision by you as a body, collective direction to us. Same thing about bus shelters. How important is our customers' comfort and convenience while waiting for a bus stop? But when the board sets those high levels, you speak as a body with one voice. Something that's gotten us into trouble in the past. Attempts at individual control and exertion over the budgeting process can lead to a bit of an arms race. We want to make sure we don't fall back into that process. So policy governance keeps us all sort of on the same level. And you, speaking as one body, it also tells us in advance what you want, so we can go out and find the best way to do it for you. That's some thoughts on the process.
I want to add something to what Matt has said from my perspective, having been on the board and now being chair, is it's super important for the board to take the time to review the documentation that's being presented. So when the business plan was presented, to really look at it with an eagle eye. Does that business plan meet your individual needs, what you deemed to be in the executive limitations to be in the ends? Is it meeting our long-range plan? If you see something in the business plan that you do not agree with, that's the time to start bringing these issues up. Tonight, we're going to hear an excellent preview. Mike and I had an opportunity to meet with Dina earlier this week to talk about the budget. She's going to give us an excellent preview tonight that may help answer some of your questions about details about budget, and also the conundrums that we're going to be hitting about assumptions and things like that that are happening that are out of our control. But that's the important first step. Then we go into August, where we're going to see a draft budget. That is another excellent opportunity. Please take the time to read that budget as much as possible. If you have questions, staff, Matt has already indicated that staff are more than willing to sit down and talk. That is the time to have these serious discussions about HVAC and things like that. So by the time we get to September, we've already asked all the questions or had our concerns raised and answered. I would very much like for us to take ownership of that, and for us to be able to support staff in that way, because we have given them a very, the yeoman's job. We have said, you are the industry experts. We trust you. We know that you know how to make a budget. And then we say, with our executive limitations and our ends, this is the way we don't want you to do it. These are the parameters you have to work within. In addition, they also have to look at state and local and FTA and all the other different laws and things that are out there. So I guess what I'm saying to you, and maybe I'm being long-winded about this, is that now is really the time to listen to Dina tonight about the budget preview, to really take it to heart, and any concerns or questions that you have, no matter what it is, it's valid, it's important, because if you're thinking it, someone else might be thinking it, so we want to hear everyone's point of view. And then please make sure that you come with all that stuff to the table in August, so that when we get to September, there are not any surprises. But I'm not saying that was wrong either. I'm saying that was just what happened last year, but there's a way that we can maybe mitigate it this year by understanding the process a little bit better. I feel like maybe we did a disservice by not having continued education about the budget process. So that is why we were undertaking it this year, to really nail down how do we support staff getting this budget prepared under what we have decided that we want the agency to go in through our visions. So go ahead, Rich, thank you.
So I want to throw an idea out to the board to consider, because in the end, I personally don't really care about the numbers in the budget. What I care about are the ends, right? I think that's what we all care about. And one of the things that Susan continually brings up, right, is like, are we increasing ridership? And that's something that I very much care about. And as I'm listening to discussions and I'm looking at this, thank you for this printout of the ends, I'm wondering if part of the challenge is that, I guess the question I have is, if we look at these ends, right, there's 5 here, are we expecting that staff is supposed to look at these and consider every single one of these ends as an equal amount of effort and, I don't know, like concentration every budget cycle? Or are there times where we're saying like, well, in 2024, we really want a lot of effort being put toward ends number 1 and ends number 1.2? Right? And maybe that is something, because in the end, that is probably going to drive what they do in the budget and where the money in that big pie of 100% of the money that they have to be able to work with, like how much of that do they actually slice off for each of these different ends? And I don't know if that's maybe something for us to consider having a discussion of, okay, maybe that is part of our directive, I guess, to staff of, in this particular budget cycle, we really want to see a lot of more focus and effort put toward increasing the number of residents that actually use our service. Because I know it drives a lot of stuff trickle down from there, but I don't know if that would be helpful for us to maybe consider discussing as an approach moving forward in a future time.
I hear exactly what you're saying, Rich, and in my mind, I'm thinking when staff bring us the, one moment, no, the Building Our Future, the corporate business plan, where they're talking about the next year and how they've extrapolated the ends and executive limitations and where they think that we're telling them to go. To me, that's where that question you just asked is a very appropriate question. So in other words, if I am looking at the business plan and ridership, I'm not seeing ridership in the business plan, and I think that is a really important thing, then that, to me, is where then we have to drive and have that discussion as a board. I don't know that it would be fair or prudent or even possible to sit down in May, April, March, and say, okay, we've got these ends, and now we want to do 1 and 1.4. And that's all we want to really worry about, because we also have all these other things wrapped up. We've got the long-range plan that really seriously has these dates and these time points set that we've already said we want to have happen. So, but I think that you're on the right track. I think that those are the questions that we need to have internally when we're actually reading the budget plan, or the process, the business plan. That we're thinking about those ends. Does that make sense?
It does. So actually it was, so the next thing is I figured that was going to be the understand our response is, I know this could potentially be like a lot of effort and work, so it's something I would love to get staff feedback, but I know this is one of the most impressive organizations in regards to data you provide to us and how you provide it. And I don't know if there's a way, this is probably a bigger discussion, right, where when you are presenting that budget, is based on each of these ends, is to say like, well, based on the budget we present to you, these particular sections of the budget all help us with ends number one. These particular parts of the budget help us with 1.2, because I think when it comes to sustainability, we're like, okay, well, which of these line items do we actually care about in regards to what's happening with the environment? I don't know if that's something that's, I'm going to probably say out front, I doubt it's very easy to do, but it would be a very interesting piece of information, at least for me, in order when I'm evaluating, like, oh, okay, it looks like, frankly, I don't know, 50% of this budget is going toward increasing residents' ridership in the end. And that's like a little piece of data. You're like, okay, I feel confident that the numbers that are in this huge spreadsheet actually go toward achieving some particular goal. Whereas right now, I just go like, seems to look good. I don't really know exactly how it's impacting these ends, but I trust the staff because you guys have proven that you can do this, but maybe that'll answer a bunch of these different questions that we all have in our heads.
That's a very good point. Matt or Dina, do you have any thoughts on what was asked?
First response is, that's a great segue to Dina's presentation, because that is something we've explicitly been discussing. The work of cross-referencing which initiatives are supporting which ends is already completed for everything in the long-range plan. It's a little difficult to classify maintaining existing services, so we're sort of digging into how that works. Rosa and I have been rebuilding the business plan along Susan's suggested lines with a much greater focus on the attraction and retention of ridership, because that is the focus of your ends. As we've been putting Humpty Dumpty back together again over the last 12, 18 months, we weren't quite ready in this budget cycle. I think we got close with this business plan. If you go back to that document and you look in the Gantt charts about the operating initiatives, excuse me, and the capital plans, you will see cross-referencing to which ends specifically do occur. It's not quantitative, 50% here and 20% there. It's much more qualitative, high level. But I do think it is the direction your ends suggest we ought to be aligning the organization in. We are already making good progress on that. I'd love to bring you an update to that at some point in the future. It is a bit tied up in other efforts at staff engagement, and I do not mean to sound like I'm making excuses. I want to be clear about that. As we heard with treatment of staff, engagement's important. Staff want to feel like they have some ownership and ability to influence the direction of the organization. Rosa and I had a very nice long chat just this morning, 12 hours ago, about that very subject. How fast can we push the organization without staff feeling like they're getting ridden over? So there's a balance going on there. But I would love to plan to bring you an update, specifically perhaps a tweak to the business plan with a greater emphasis, as Susan has said, and as your ends do suggest, on ridership as a focus. To the other question about prioritizing ends or ranking them, I think it's entirely within the board's purview to suggest you want more emphasis in one area or another. It has to be done within the context of the very long lead times that I need to build you the infrastructure you want. So in October, Simi, Susan, and if she was still here, Liz, would be glad to hear, we're making a lot of progress on your zero emissions bus proposal. Had a nice long chat with George and Troy about it this afternoon during the monsoon. It doesn't lend itself well to piecemeal approaches. It's very expensive. It's going to come in big chunks. So in October, you're going to see a budget amendment with a proposal, but it's too big to be chunked up into really small bits. I'm trying to find a sweet spot where it's small enough that it's, the risk issue doesn't rub anybody the wrong way, but it's big enough to make a difference. So I look forward to bringing you all of this information. I don't want to belabor the question about budget process. I feel like that's kind of lost its way this evening. But I think some of the things you are interested in Dina can give you a bit of a taste of where that is headed and where it's going. We're not presenting line items, to be clear, but we're getting, 30,000 feet, 15,000 feet. She's taken it down to 10,000 feet. If you are ready to move along, we are happy to do that.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Seeing none from the board, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rose, I think has already taken off, but we appreciate her time with us this evening. So now we're on to the budget preview, budget update by Ms. Dina Reed.
Good evening, everyone. This is a nice, healthy lead-in to my presentation tonight, and I'll just preface that by saying, this presentation by saying that I'm trying a couple new things by presenting things a little bit differently, so I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback and hoping we're hitting some good points based on the conversation that we're having tonight. Our agenda is a budget introduction and then to go through some key points for the FY 2024 operating budget and preview. All of the information that I'm presenting tonight is in your packet in a different format in the issue brief, where I gave an introduction about the budget, what's driving the budget. I gave you some tables and some graphs, some revenues and expenses, and gave significant detail of assumptions. This is going to be a much higher level overview of that, hitting the key points and key direction that we're focused on right now. The first thing I want to mention is that as we've talked a lot about, we are focused on advancing the board's ends, and we're going to do that through alignment with board policies, the corporate business plan, which then leads to the budget and for staff, and then staff to execute throughout the year. So this is kind of the high level process by which we use the budget to, like I said, align and advance the board's ends. The corporate business plan had several high-level objectives, and we are focused on those: maintaining current services, implementing the long-range plan, and process improvement. So you'll see a little bit throughout the presentation how we're planning to do that, or how funding is coming together to fund that. What we are working on right now is initiatives directly tied to the corporate business plan for this fiscal year, above and beyond our normal maintaining current services. So we'll get into that as we get through the process. But those initiatives aren't in the current budget that was proposed or that's presented to you today because of the timing of where we're at in the process, which brings me to the budget timeline. This is our general process for the budget timeline. Our budget actually starts with the corporate business plan. Once the corporate business plan has been drafted and reviewed and completed, staff start to think about what kinds of initiatives they want to do. Around the same time, we start preparing what we call our current services budget, or our baseline budget. It's the budget that says, how much is it going to cost this year to do what we've already committed to doing, whether it's currently what we're doing today or what we've committed to do through the millage plan is a good example. So we're not currently operating the services that were approved in the millage plan, but we're planning to, and we're going to have to budget for that. So that's part of the current services budget because it's something we're already committed to doing as an organization. As you can see through the budget timeline, there are significant, it's color coded. If you can see the colors, I hope you can. The salmon color is more where staff engagement is, and most of the heavy lifting is for staff, which you might expect would be at the beginning of the process. It doesn't stop in the beginning, and there are many touch points throughout the next couple of months in July and August as well. But for the board's purpose, I just wanted to demonstrate the multiple opportunities that the board has in the budget process to provide feedback and information and guidance on how you see the budget coming together and things that you might want to see as part of the project process, or recommendations related to things that we're funding in the budget that you might want to make along the way. So you can see in blue that we have board reviews of the budget throughout committee meetings and board meetings from now until September. We are in the very sort of beginning of the process on July 20th here, as you might see. So I just wanted to point out that we are still at the beginning of the process, and that's why we call this a preview. This is the initial draft of staff's recommendation to us, and we're still analyzing the details. We're still looking at assumptions. We've provided assumptions to you in detail to show you what's in there now, but we have more to do. We have a lot of assumptions that will change throughout the summer, and we'll continue to keep the board updated as we make those adjustments. Additionally, we have a responsibility to be very clear to the public about what we're doing and be very, very transparent. So we have a couple of touch points here where July and August we'll do a public budget preview, which will be an opportunity as well for public comment directly on the budget. And then in August, as required by law, we will do an official public hearing where we'll, again, present the budget to the board in draft form, which will be specifically another opportunity for the board, or for the public to respond during that board meeting. And also, any board meeting offers public comment, so there's an opportunity at really any of these, but two specific times in here are times that we're committed to presenting information to the public with the intent of receiving meaningful feedback on the budget. I also wanted to note that there was a lot of discussion this evening about the policies that guide the budget process. I wanted to mention and remind the board that as part of the recommended budget approval in September, we also present Policy 2.4, Financial Conditions and Activities, which sets out the parameters under which we have to complete the budget. So you will monitor that report in advance of approving the budget, so they're tied together. And we've talked a little bit about this, and I'm not going to read through these, but I just want to note specifically that we are very intent on following the board's policies and achieving the board's ends. We comply with best practices. We comply with federal, state, and local regulations. We will show you multi-year forecasting. We will show you cash flows. We will incorporate a strategic approach to both operating and capital budgeting, and we will present that throughout the budget process. So today, you'll see some of that. In August, you'll see more of that. And as we move through the process, and by the time we get to September, we'll have met all the conditions in Policy 2.4. And our intent is to be transparent and give the board all the information they need to make a good decision about the budget with the context that you need to do so. So I just want to share with you as part of the intro some preview highlights. If you had a chance to review in the packet, the issue brief, the main key points for this budget are that we're operating at full service levels. That's our assumption going into the budget process. We are also accelerating millage services, which is putting some cost pressure on the budget, and we'll explain that as we go through. We are not planning any fare changes for this budget cycle. Fare changes are required to have board approval if we were going to do so, and there's a long process to do that. We haven't begun that, and there's no intent to do that this year. And the budget will be balanced. The budget that we presented in the issue brief is balanced. As we move through the budget process and we tighten up expenses and revenue projections, we will continue to present a balanced budget. Any questions about anything I've said so far? I'm going to move into just a brief overview of the operating and capital budgets next. So one of the key drivers of one of the revenue components and a really important question that the board has raised several times is how is ridership doing? So I wanted to share with you the current ridership projection. This was just updated last week. It is still under review and will be evaluated throughout the budget process and updated if updates are necessary. I did want to share that for fiscal year 23, we projected that we'd be back to levels of 69% of where we were in 2019. And it was projected to be 70%, 69.8% if you want to be exact. And we are looking at 69% for fiscal year 23. So we are making progress based on last year's projection. I'm pleased to report that. And I'm also pleased to report that our projection for fiscal year '24 indicates that we will be at 78% of pre-pandemic levels. That is the percentage that we're comparing to is the pre-pandemic level from 2019. And that's a really important statistic that we're following and continue to work on. With that, I do want to share that our operating budget is balanced. Our revenues and expenses are $60.6 million. And this is a little bit different representation of what we're spending our money on. It's sort of an effort to answer Rich's question on some level, which is what are we actually doing with our money? Where does it come from? So you have all of this information in your packet, but it's not summarized exactly this way, especially on the expense side. On the revenue side, you can see property tax revenues, you can see state operating assistance, several lines of federal operating assistance, and passenger revenues. On the expense side, and they're noted here, you can see that a majority of our funding is property tax revenue, well, a high 1/3. Then we get state operating assistance, which is a percent that we get from the state of our expenses, of all eligible expenses. And then we have a couple different forms of state operating assistance. A significant change in the budget this year is the federal operating assistance assumption. That could change, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but I'm sure if you did look at that table, you would notice that federal operating assistance is going up significantly, and pandemic relief funds are going down. So that's something I'm going to talk about on the next slide. On expenses, I try to categorize expenses here based on what we're spending our money on. Transportation services is about $36.4 million, which you can see is a majority of our budget. Purchase transportation, which is also service on the street, is also $13 million. It's just the outsourced version of that. So if you combine those two together, $49 million of our $60 million budget is directly related to service on the street. It is a combination of the current services that we're already offering and additional millage services that we're advancing in fiscal year '24. I do want to note that the property tax revenue funding related to the millage will not actually be available until fiscal year '25. It gets levied in 2024. We receive the funding in late 2024, and then we'll have it for fiscal year '25. So in 2024, as we're phasing in and preparing and beginning that service in the fall of 2024, we are accelerating that, but we are utilizing or planning to use at this point, assuming that we're going to use federal operating assistance to assist with that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to share that that's a cost pressure. Regarding expenses as a whole, administration is $6 million of our budget, which is less than 10%, just under. And then you can see that we have utilities and insurance, which is a separate category in here because even though it does directly support the operations, obviously we have insurance for buses and things like that, but we also have facilities and utilities that in our facilities. So I separate that out just to show, so that it's not to get confused or there's no really good way to break that out at this point. So I just break it out that way. So another thing that typically we talk about are the changes between one year to the next. And in your packet, you'll see the variances in a more detailed level. I just want to share with you that, as I mentioned before, revenues are going down as a whole from 23 to 24, and they're going down significantly, 10%, $6.9 million. The really driving factor there is the loss or the completion of using pandemic relief funds. So you may remember or may have seen in the current budget that we're using somewhere around $17 million of pandemic relief funds every year. And in the past 3 years, this will be the third year. And what we're doing is we're using those funds as quickly as we can to support operations. That has actually caused a surplus in the past couple of years, and it will again in fiscal year '23. In fiscal year '24, as we projected, we will use the balance of pandemic relief funds. And the balance of those funds right now, we're anticipating to be about 5.5 million, which is about $12 million less than what we plan to use this year. So it's a significant reduction in revenue, but it's not a major concern because we were getting a surplus before, so now we just won't have a surplus. So like I said, pandemic relief funds are going down significantly, but we do have additional property tax revenues, more state and federal operating assistance, and a small increase in passenger revenues that are helping offset that. So the net is a $6.9 million decrease in revenue. The expenses are going up $4.6 million, which is 8.3%. And that is a result mostly of accelerating the expansion services that are approved in the millage. So this is an assumption that we're still working through. We expect to have, when we have committed in the millage, to start expansion of services in the fall, in August of 2024. So we have to phase in staffing and we have to phase in other things in advance of that in order to be ready to actually start the service. So we have built-in current assumptions related to when we need to hire people, how many people we need to hire is based on the original assumption of what we asked for in the millage. So it's not a difference in cost, it's just how are we gonna pay for it this year and when does it start? So we've got some more work to do with operations. We put initial assumptions in which we think are good, but we have additional work to do, and I do expect that that will be adjusted throughout the process. I don't expect it will drive a major variance, but if we find that it does, we'll be bringing it back to you and you will see it through the process. But right now, I think the assumptions are good. As a whole, we just want to fine tune that a little bit, so we'll be looking at that throughout the process. We also have some inflationary pressures beyond normal inflation levels. One of the challenges that we're facing is that the supplies for bus parts and buses in general, which is more part of capital, but bus parts falls under materials and supplies for us. Those are materials to fix buses and things like that. We're seeing a significant increase in costs related to those. So we have put a projection in here that we think is adequate to cover the needs that we have, and we'll be reviewing that throughout the next month or two to see if our assumptions will still hold. But right now, that is a cost pressure. Another inflationary pressure that we need to be aware of is that we are somewhat shielded from the most recent cost inflation factors because we have contracts that are multi-year contracts. And so that protects us a little bit from the market risk all at one time. But what happens is over time, those contracts need to be rebid. We come to the end of a contract and they need to be rebid. And when that happens, we're fully exposed to the market risk. And sometimes we're exposed to market risk for 2 years of market increases that we haven't experienced yet. So we will keep the board apprised of how that impacts the budget throughout the budget process. Like I said, right now, we think, we have our initial assumptions in there. I just want you to be aware that we're cognitive of it, and it is a risk that we're facing and something that we're gonna monitor. Some good news on diesel fuel for once is that even though we're seeing a little bit of cost increase for diesel fuel because we're adding additional services, the cost of diesel fuel per gallon has declined. So budget to budget, we're actually seeing a decrease in the diesel fuel line, offsetting some of those other expense increases, just because the rate has gone down a little bit and stabilized, and that's built into our projections as well. So the net impact of the decrease in revenues and the increase in expenses is that even though we have a balanced budget, we will not project any surplus for fiscal year 2024. And I wanted to share with you, this is our projection that we have shown this multiple times. And at this point, I think it's important to remind the board that a couple of years ago, this graph looked very differently. We were projecting a deficit beginning in 2020. I think originally it might have been like 2026, but when pandemic relief funds came on the scene, that kind of helped us through. And then we were projecting a deficit as early as 2024. Fortunately, we were able to do the work that needed to be done and go to the community for support with the millage, and a portion of that millage that was approved last year was for maintaining current services. And so once that millage was approved, that really changed the game for our forecast. It allowed for enough funding to maintain the current services and then the expansion of services to even add more services. So we want everyone to know that we're still very grateful for that and that we're putting that money to use in this budget. That's why the costs are going up, because we're adding staff and we're adding service. This projection shows that while we're doing that, you can see in 2024, we're breaking even, as I just mentioned. And then in the projection period, we do have we may, depending on how expense projections fall out, may have a little bit of a surplus in the first couple of years of the millage, just because we had to set the millage for year 5 to make sure we had enough money by the end of the millage year as well. So you can see that by the end of the millage, we're actually going to be breaking even again, and there may need to be considerations about how to maintain services at that point. But this projection includes the full impact of all millage services that were approved in the millage to the full extent. Partial in 24 as we phase in, and then in 2025 a full impact. We will continue to do reviews of the forecast and keep presenting this information to you throughout the budget process as well. And then on to a little bit about capital. I do want to mention that today, the capital budget is very much in the developmental phase. As I mentioned a minute ago, cost pressures are significant. It's really going to impact us in the capital budget. One of the biggest concerns we have is the cost of buses and the cost of maintaining our facilities. We are really getting approached consistently by people that we are doing business with because their costs are going up for cost increases. Our strategy and approach to that at this point has been to hold to our contracts. We have not given any kind of negotiated any kind of increase above our current contracts. That is something we took a lot of time and energy to look at in the past couple of months to see what we could do, what's reasonable, what we think we should do, and our strategy is just to hold to those contracts. So we do have an issue with our bus supplier and that we're working through. Some of you may have heard a little bit about that. I'm not going to get into the details today, but it looks like we may be looking at a bus procurement in the near future or some other way to procure buses until that procurement can be completed, which was not expected just based on one of the issues with our suppliers. So that could open us up to the market risk associated with that contract. So we're assessing all of the implications of that, and certainly can't discuss that today, but just wanted to share with you that's a cost pressure. Because of that, we did increase the capital budget assumptions for state of good repair for buses to add additional funding for that, just to prepare ourselves and to bear that market risk. We do have in this capital budget an assumption that we're going to purchase 10 buses next year, and that is also contingent on the ability to procure them depending on the contract. So all of those things are still being considered, and I do expect that in the next month or two we'll have a little more information. So I do expect that we'll see changes to the capital budget. We also have a similar issue on a facilities project that we're looking at where we had an issue with a supplier or a potential supplier there on a contract. So we're, again, evaluating that. We're doing the best we can to keep costs down, but also have to take care of our facilities. So we're evaluating that, but that could significantly change one of the elements of our capital budget as well. So this is where we're at today, but there is still a lot of work to be done. Another important point on this slide is the amount of federal funding we get for capital investments. You can see here that a significant portion of our capital funding is federal. We get pretty much 80-20 split between federal and state on our capital funding. So that is good news, but one of the risks to our capital budget is the discussions in Washington DC about the IIJA and impacts of what that could do to our 5307 funding, which is a major source of our capital funding that we rely on for state of good repair. We do think that it's stable. We haven't heard anything yet, but there was I don't know if you remember, but there was a 30% increase on federal funding as part of the IIJA, Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And that is still solid, but that was for a moment something that was being thrown around as we don't know if we're still going to get that 30%, but it was only for a few years, and that funding is going to go away by next year anyway. So, but for now, we still have it as far as I know for 24. We're going to continue to work through that. So I've touched on a lot of budget risks. I want to touch on a few opportunities. We do have the opportunity, as I mentioned before, to continue to service our communities, both in terms of what we're providing today and what we plan to provide over the next 5 years. So the good news is we have strong community support that is excellent for putting service on the street and also for having the ability to compete for discretionary funding. Anytime you can bring local money to the table, or show or demonstrate the strength of your community support of your operation, it's a very strong argument in Washington, D.C. when it comes to that sort of funding. So wanted to point out that that's a wonderful opportunity for us operating here. We are also, as I mentioned before, accelerating the millage services, and we're doing more planning for the long-range plan. And we also have the approved millage, which provides us the opportunities that I just talked about. Risks. Same things I mentioned, I'm not going to go through them all, but I think the one thing we really are focused on besides maximizing our state and federal funding, focusing on the opportunity for more funding when funding opportunities arrives, is the phasing of the long-range plan. So as we have more information on how that's phased in or going to be phased in, there could be some risks there with cost and funding. And of course, ridership recovery is something that we're really focused on improving and maintaining and improving. But it is a risk. It's something that we are intent on hopefully eventually seeing that as more of an opportunity as we move through. And in closing, we are planning to operate full service levels, accelerate millage services, no fare changes, and our budget is balanced. And as I mentioned before, I'll continue to provide updated assumptions, updated information, and even more information, which will result, if any of you have happened to seen the budget book or have had a chance to review it, that is the same budget book or something similar to that, very similar to that, will be presented to you in advance of the September meeting after we discuss the budget in August and have kind of tighten up all those budget assumptions. So you can expect all of the same information that you've received in the past, and we'll try and tailor it to the comments that we receive tonight and throughout the budget process to make it more palatable and more understandable for you, and so you have the information you need when it comes to requesting budget approval in September. That concludes my presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions or take comments.
Thank you, Dina, to you and your team. I'm going to open it up to the board now. Does anyone have any questions, comments? Susan.
So I jotted down a few questions, but rather than take time tonight, how would you like us to relay questions to you?
You can, your choice. I'd prefer if you send me an email directly, copy Matt, of course, and just kind of give me a flavor of the questions and let me know whether you'd like me to respond in email or if you'd like me to set up a meeting where we can have a brief discussion. I'm happy to do that. I do that with the board chair and the board treasurer already, and I'm happy to do that for any board member who wants to review any part of the budget or ask additional questions or even make recommendations. Email me and request a meeting is fine as well.
Jesse.
Thank you, Dina. I would like to, in terms of how you present, how you make your next presentation, I would really like to see, at least at a high level, how elements of the corporate business plan are implemented in this budget. Like, for instance, there's there were like studies on like the zero emissions A-Ride fleet, and there's like the word study doesn't appear anywhere in this particular. So I would, I don't need to know like how much it costs, if like, but I just want to make sure that I would like to see some tie-in between the corporate business plan and the budget. But it sounds like we're working on that, and that's great. I have two other questions. One is when does the 2024 millage money, like when do we receive that? I guess I for some reason I had in my head that we received that in August, but it sounds like we don't.
We do, but it funds the next fiscal year. Since our fiscal year ends on September 30th, like we couldn't start spending it earlier that year.
Mm-hmm.
So in the budget, right?
All
So
right.
we'd have to fund it for the next fiscal year. So,
Okay.
yes, physically, cash flow wise, it will be coming in late July, August, and sometimes a little bit late in August.
Okay. And then in what is probably going to be the wonkiest question you get tonight, the whole using federal capital funds to fund operations. I remember talking to you about that at the APTA conference. It was a very hotly debated topic, and I, again, kind of came out of that conversation kind of thinking that we weren't going to do that, and
You're right.
yeah.
I recall that too, so that's good. No, we aren't going to do that. We do not plan to do that starting in fiscal year 25, once we receive the millage funding. So you may remember that one of the line items in the millage proposal was funding so that we could stop doing that. This year, as we're accelerating the millage service plan, and having to phase it in before we actually receive the funds, one thing we have to grapple with is what is the best way to fund that? And I thank you for asking that question, because I don't mind answering that. That's still under review. So right now, in this draft, in this preview, I've assumed that we could use federal operating assistance, which we can. It is eligible, and we have the funding to do it. Another option that we could consider is, since we don't feel that we're at risk with the pandemic relief funds in terms of any clawbacks or anything like that, we could slow down the use of pandemic relief funds this fiscal year, reducing the surplus in this fiscal year, which would reduce the amount going into the capital reserve, but we wouldn't be taking anything out of the reserve. We would only be reducing the amount that goes in so that we could save some more pandemic relief funds for next year. Alternatively, we could continue our current practice of expending the pandemic relief funds as we have been, as quickly as possible. We could use federal operating assistance. The other thing that could happen is we are looking at the impacts of the state funding that is coming into play. So there's been, you probably saw a press release about that. There is a one-time event where they've cleaned out basically an account, and that money is coming into transit. So I don't know what the full impact of that is, but whatever it is, we should realize it in the next fiscal year. And we would obviously then have additional revenue, only for 1 year, so we can't do a bunch of new things that would be long-term things, but it could help us bridge this gap this next year. And when I have more information about how much that will be, that could help us in the budgeting process. So there are several ways that we can think about what kind of revenue we can use to kind of bridge the gap between when we receive the funding from the millage and when we're actually starting services. And we're going to continue to review that and update the board on what our recommendation is throughout the process.
Okay, so yeah, I'm just trying to make sure I'm interpreting when you say the federal operating assistance is increasing by 85.5% due to the assumption that those formula funds can be used on operations. That's not saying that work. I guess I'm not sure that I'm interpreting that phrase correctly.
If I might?
Sure.
1 year, and then we're done.
Okay.
So, and this is a good opportunity to sort of take for me to draw some connective tissue.
Yes.
You said increase ridership. We said, how do we do that? Accelerate the millage services. We don't get the money for another 18 months from now, but we're going to start running them in April. or some of them. We're already staffing the YTC. That creates money. We need more money. We don't have that money yet. Where are we getting that money? Dina's outlined at least 3 potential pots of money, all of which have laws attached to them, strings attached to them, all sorts of challenges. What she's talking about is we're still working as a management team to figure out the best way to fund that acceleration. And I think she mentioned this in passing. In order to maximize the total amount of money available to the agency, if we pick the wrong pot, we made it, I was over-explaining, we pay double for something. It's a bad explanation. But if we pick the right pot, we can leverage something else, bring in a couple extra bucks. It works really well for us. But it's a very complicated Tetris game in the federal funding pots. So I wanted to draw that connection for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I also want to add what I can say confidently is that what I've put in the budget is money that is available to us for that purpose. And so there's no risk to that. It's just a matter of what is the best way to fund the operating budget with what source of funding. But for now, that's what the assumption is.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you again, Dina.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And we're going to move on to the CEO report.
I got nothing. In all seriousness, the report, I think, outlines many things that are important. If there are any questions about it, I'm happy to chat. One thing, because it was mentioned a bit earlier about bus lanes, a small win, I think related to work with MDOT. We managed to have a nice chat with them about the bridge of US 23 over Washtenaw. That's probably the most important choke point for any BRT service in the future. Washtenaw Avenue, Ann Arbor to Ypsilanti's got to go under that bridge. That bridge's footings are pretty constrained. If you drive through it, there's not any shoulder left. Our big thing going into that was we need them to make that bridge wider so that there's at least the possibility for bus lanes in there in the future. Because if that bridge gets rebuilt as it is, we're kind of, I was going to use a colorful constrained. Thank you. I was going to use a more colorful euphemism for 50 years. So that to us is something that we have to do. And we were pleasantly surprised to find MDOT agreeing with us. I actually had to pinch myself because I felt like something was wrong. So that went better than we expected. So that's a huge thing, a battle we thought we were going to have a long thing over might be a lot easier. So that's the one thing I would highlight. There's a lot of other things in the CEO report. If you want more information, I'm happy to answer any questions.
And with that, are there any questions? Thank you very much, Matt. We're going to move on to action item recap between you and Ms. Holt.
Right.
There's a lot.
I'm a little rusty. You take a month off and you forget. Okay. Let's run down. Title VI, we got stuff coming. Public information is running forward. Were there action items for us that the board asked for?
Yes, Matt. I'm going to email the board the public meeting information, so board has that, and then if they choose to participate, they could.
Thank you.
Was there anything else? All right. Ownership linkage. Rich is on deck to send some emails. Anything you'd like to add on that, Rich? Okay. Monitoring task force. Going well. I didn't hear anything specifically out of that. Financial conditions and activities resolved. Treatment of staff was accepted. Treatment of the traveling public was approved. Congratulations, Jesse. We will update the board manual and circulate a new version to you promptly. Sustainability policy. Awkwardly going back for more discussion. I'd like to volunteer if I can help nudge. I certainly will, but I defer to the task force invitation. Budget education, I think more to be discussed there, but I didn't hear any specific asks pertaining to that. Budget update, Dina will be coming back. I think a request for more specific examples of ridership growth and tie-ins with the business plan was made, so we can make sure those things come in. Did I miss things? I feel like I did.
Well, I would just like to be more specific. What I asked from Rose was, I want her help drafting exactly what could be brought to the board. Because as I said, we've been playing whack-a-mole. We keep bringing ideas, and we keep hearing, no, not this, no, not this, no, not this. So I would like very much in the next very short period of time to sit down and not leave that meeting until we actually have language that we could bring back to this board.
I'm happy to relay that she has made that commitment, so we will make sure. Thank you for clarifying. Rich?
I just had one more, is Forrest and I just to chat about the Title VI and lower income in Alice, so.
Sorry, Rich, I
No
forgot
worries.
about that.
No worries.
Yep, thank you. If there's nothing else, I think that's our action item recap, roundup. Thank you.
Sounds good. And then under topics for next meeting, we'll go with what is already there. And then in September, we'll hear about Title VI. And in October, we'll hear about 2.4, 2.8, the monitoring reports. But those are way out. So I don't have anything in addition to topics for next meeting unless I miss something for August. Nothing? Okay. Sounds great. Everybody, you worked really hard tonight. Thank you for your time. I need a motion to, oh, I'm sorry. I am so sorry because you have given your time as well. I was so excited. Public comment. Sorry.
Don't be sorry about that. We all know everyone wants to go home. It's okay. Robert Pulowski again, Citizens Advisory Committee Vice Chair for the Regional Transit Authority. So I wanted to come down and personally, this is some news I've been working on with my committee over the last couple months. Our committee met last month discussing topics of partnerships. I know this is something I discussed at our last meeting that I was somewhat able to get out, but I was actually in the Smart Board of Directors meeting that same day. Quite ironic. So one of the things that we're looking for is transparency. I know Matthew did a presentation in front of the RTA, was it a couple months back, in front of our board, and gave us some updates regarding service and what has been accomplished over the last couple of months, but also to a year since the last time they presented. One of the things that we're looking at is working with local advisory councils between the three agencies, DDOT having already someone covered, but also working with our chair, Cheryl Weber, but also our board chair, Kathleen Mozak, to be able to provide us updates every bi-monthly of what's going on in the systems. One of the things that we looked at was appointing you, Madam Chair, to take over a liaison position for us, but we also are expanding the options to be able to let everyone have an interest if they're interested in joining the CAC, to not just get a feeling, but also help us out in trying to be more transparent, to be able to help us out as a region. What is the region focusing on more? What is each agency working on most of all? Let me give you a prime example. TheRide doesn't really receive a lot of media coverage in terms of a metro standpoint. Local 4, WXYZ, CBS News, there's not a lot of coverage there unless there's some type of assault inside the Blake Transit Center, and that's the one thing that's the most importantly that needs to be covered. That's bad press. We want to see more press being involved in terms of TheRide and seeing what TheRide's doing. I personally want to see the long-range plan being promoted on Local 4. That's going to really give people an insight. Transportation is really being expanded here in this region, and we look at SMART, and they're getting more media coverage. You know why? Because they're the major transit agency here in this region. But as of course, they're slacking, and TheRide is doing more work. Not to throw you guys in a bit of a steam here, but you know, TheRide has also focused on increasing towards the future what we saw in Dina's budget, and thank you for answering my question on the state budget. I really appreciate that. But long term, we need someone to be transparent, and we need information. I can't do this for much longer. I'm going into college as of September, so there's going to be someone that's going to be able to at least help us out in terms of getting information. But I will be leaving information for Robert for our LAC, and I'll be leaving information for our board with Deborah to be able to reach out if anyone's interested in joining the CIC to help us out with being transparent, but also providing us information. Again, great meeting. Sorry to keep you guys waiting, and hope you enjoy the street fair. I know I will. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pulaski. Deborah, I believe we have someone online.
Yep, Jim Mogensen, and you are unmuted.
So, so I've been, I was trying to figure out how long I've been monitoring the AATA, and I think it's 20 years. And because of that, I just wanted to give a little bit of quick perspective. When I first started monitoring, a former staff member said, "Oh, Jim, members of the public aren't allowed to, they don't attend board meetings." Well, that obviously changed. I decided that doesn't sound right, so I'm going to start. At that time, it was the perpetual Ann Arbor tax, the federal state money, the fairs, right? Everything was pretty structured. And the staff figured out what to do, and the board approved it. Essentially, that's how it worked. The thing that changed is when there was the change with the millage proposal, the 0.7 millage initially, the staff, utilizing that culture, figured out how much money they needed. And they figured out exactly how much money they needed. But after the millage, people said, no, wait a minute, we need hybrid buses. And somewhere in a banker's box in my basement is the staff report said, no, we already looked at that and we're concerned that the hybrid buses will break and they're more expensive, and we didn't put that in the financial calculations. And then that haggling that people may be thinking about happened. I remember that happening in a room very close to where you are. Went into effect, and that's how we ended up with those hybrid buses. And as I understand it, over time, the finances fell apart. That's why that happened. So now we have the new millage, the most recent millage. And I may be wrong, but as I remember it, the propulsion study came out after the millage was passed. So the things that were in the propulsion study were not, the decisions that have to be made as a result of the propulsion study were not included in the millage. And so, as they say, deja vu all over again. The concern is, moving forward, there are now expectations in the community. When I first started watching 20 years ago, it didn't matter because everything was static. But now we have millages and we have people who are more invested politically in what's happening at the AATA. And the concern, of course, is even looking at the budget presentation, I was still trying to see if they were there. So finally, I'm glad to know that monitoring helps. I was at a Watts meeting when MDOT first brought up the bridge thing several years ago. And I brought up that there was a BRT and you better keep that in mind. And I'm glad to see that happened. I'm not taking credit for it, but it's one of those things where you just always monitor it. And I think that might have helped happening at the Watts meeting as to why you were successful in having that perspective. And thank you very much for your time and attention. And then I'll expand more later. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Mogensen. Deborah, is there anyone else?
Nope, that was it.
Thank you so much for everyone's patience this evening. That ends public comment, and we are now on to adjournment. May I have a motion to adjourn? Simi, seconded by Susan. All in favor? Wonderful. We're adjourned.